Hey everyone. Welcome back to No Harry. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if Harry accidentally time traveled to Founders era and became apprentice to all 4 founders? Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Wrong Direction. The Department of Mysteries smelled like ozone and old decisions. Harry had learned that about the place over the past 3 months, ever since Kingsley had quietly, almost apologetically, asked him if he'd consider consulting for the unspeakables on recovered artifacts of unknown classification. Which was ministry speak for we found things in the rubble of Voldemort's operations and we have no idea what half of them do and you've touched more cursed objects than anyone alive so please help us. He'd said yes mostly because the alternative was sitting in Grimmauld Place listening to creature-polished things. The room they'd given him access to was 3 levels below the main floor, accessible only by a staircase that turned left twice and then somehow turned left a 3rd time, which Harry had stopped questioning after the first week. The walls were lined with glass cases, each one containing something the unspeakables had deemed interesting but dangerous, which, as far as Harry could tell, meant everything they couldn't immediately explain. Tonight, he was alone. He preferred it that way down here. The silence had a quality to it, deep and attentive, like the room itself was listening. The other consultants, a dour cursebreaker named Morvain and a young unspeakable called Petra who took notes on everything including the way Harry held his sandwich, had gone home an hour ago. Petra had reminded him, twice, not to touch anything without logging it first. He was currently not logging anything. The time-turner sat on the examination table in front of him, held in a containment frame of silver and spelled glass. It looked like the ones Hermione had used in 3rd year, mostly, same hourglass shape, same delicate gold chain, but where hers had been elegant and clockwork precise, this one looked angry. The glass was a deep amber rather than clear. The sand inside moved in slow, purposeful spirals even when the device was perfectly still. Someone had carved runes along the frame in a hand so old Harry's translation charm had only gotten him about 60% of them, and the 60% he had were contradictory in ways that made Petra visibly upset. The working theory, which Morvain had presented in the flat tone of a man describing the weather, was that this time-turner had belonged to a practitioner of pre-standardization magic, someone from before the international statute, possibly before the ministry itself, and that it operated on resonance rather than mechanical rotation. Normal time-turners were instruments. They did what you told them. You turned them a precise number of times and they moved you back a precise number of hours and that was that, simple and dangerous in the way that a sharp knife was simple and dangerous. This one, Morvain believed, went where it wanted to go. Or rather, where its user's magic called it to go. Which makes it essentially useless as a tool, Morvain had said, and extremely dangerous as an artifact. I recommend containment. Harry had nodded and logged that recommendation and then spent the next week thinking about it every time he couldn't sleep, which was most nights. He wasn't planning to use it. That was the honest truth when he sat down on the stool across from the containment frame and just looked at it. He wasn't planning anything, really. He was just, present with it, in the way you sometimes had to be present with dangerous things. The way he'd learned to stand very still near cursed objects and just feel whether they were pulling at him or pushing him away, whether they had intentions that pointed towards something specific. This one pulled. It had been pulling since day 1. A soft, persistent tug somewhere behind his sternum, the same feeling he used to get from the resurrection stone, from the Elder Wand, objects that had weight beyond their physical form, objects that carried the gravity of enormous things. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own wand. Cedar and phoenix feather, 11 inches, acquired the year before from Ollivander's son when his holly wand had finally given up the ghost, too many unforgivables deflected, too much wild magic channeled through it, the wood simply spent. The new wand was a good fit. Felt like holding something that had been waiting for him rather than something he'd chosen. He didn't cast anything. He just held it and looked at the time-turner and breathed. The amber sand was spiraling faster than usual. Don't, said the rational part of his brain, the part that sounded approximately like Hermione. The tug behind his sternum pulled harder. The thing about nearly dying multiple times, Harry had discovered, was that it recalibrated your relationship with fear in ways that weren't always healthy. He knew that. He'd talked to a mind healer about it for 4 months before he'd stopped going, not because it wasn't helping but because sitting in a quiet office talking about his feelings made him want to climb out the window. The mind healer had said that was itself something worth talking about. Harry had said he'd think about it. The sand was spiraling faster still. He thought, with sudden and total clarity, I wonder where it wants to go. And then, because he was Harry Potter and had never once in his life made the cautious choice when a curious one was available, he reached out and touched the containment frame. Not the device itself. Just the frame. Just to see. The room lurched. It wasn't like the time turners Hermione had described, the smooth sense of the world rewinding around you. This was violent and immediate, like the universe grabbed him by the collar. The amber sand exploded in a spiral that punched straight through the spelled glass, the containment frame vaporized, and Harry had exactly half a second to think oh no before the time turner's chain whipped out like something alive and wrapped around his wrist, and then the world went the color of the sand, deep amber, burning, and everything was moving very fast in the wrong direction. He didn't scream. He'd given up screaming in emergencies somewhere around age 15. He did swear, comprehensively, for the entire duration. He hit the ground hard enough to knock the air from his lungs, rolled instinctively because the war had made rolling automatic, and came up in a crouch with his wand already in his hand and a shield charm already forming before he'd consciously decided to cast it. Nothing attacked him. He lowered the wand slightly and looked around. Forest. Old forest, not the careful, managed wildness of the forbidden forest he knew, but something rawer than that, trees so massive 3 people holding hands couldn't have wrapped their arms around them, canopy so thick the late afternoon light came through in broken gold slabs. The air smelled like pine resin, wet earth, and something else under it, a magical tang, alive and unfiltered, the kind of ambient enchantment that didn't exist anymore in a world of wards and regulation and carefully managed magical environments. The time turner was gone. Or rather, he looked at his wrist, it was fused. The chain had melted into the skin at his wrist, not painfully, but permanently apparently, and the amber glass of the hourglass had cracked clean down the middle. The sand was still. Right, Harry said to no one. His voice came out steady, which he was proud of. He cast a quick tempest. The spell sputtered, gave him a partial result, autumn, mid-afternoon, and then died. No year. He tried a location charm and got even less, a sense of north and west that wasn't particularly useful. He tried an orientation spell that Petra had taught him for working with displaced artifacts, and that one didn't fire at all, which meant the surrounding magic was either disrupting it or so saturated that the spell couldn't find a frame of reference. Saturated, he thought, was probably the right word. It was like standing in a room where every surface was a different temperature. The ambient magic here was thick and wild and present in a way that made his skin prickle. Not threatening, but enormous. Like trying to feel a single current in an ocean. He stood up, brushed dirt and leaves from his knees, and took stock. His wand worked, the shield charm had been fine. He had the clothes he'd been wearing, which were practical enough, worn jeans, dragonhide boots that had belonged to Charlie Weasley before Harry had borrowed them and never returned them, a dark jacket with a hidden wand holster sewn in by Hermione the previous Christmas. He had a small satchel that had been over his shoulder when the chain grabbed him, containing his field notes, a self-inking quill, a tin of Helga Longbottom's extraordinary pepper imps that Neville had given him for his birthday, and a compass that was currently spinning in wide, untroubled circles and thus useless. No food. No map. No idea what century he was in. The rational Hermione voice in his head had a great deal to say about this. He told it he'd check in later and started walking. He heard them before he saw them, not voices, but magic. The specific percussion of construction spells, the bass thrum of something being anchored to bedrock, the high clear note of levitation charms holding large objects in place. It was a sound Harry associated with the aftermath of battles, all that desperate repair work, but this was different. This was building, not fixing. This was something being made. He moved toward it, staying in the tree lean. The clearing was enormous, had obviously been an enormous effort to make, given the tree stumps at its edges still fresh cut and raw. At its center, rising in stages that didn't quite make physical sense, was the beginning of a castle. Or something castle-shaped, because calling it a castle felt like calling the war a disagreement. Towers were going up with the deliberate certainty of something that intended to stay up for a very long time. The stone being used was gray and local-looking, but the way it was being laid, Harry had enough passing familiarity with building magic to recognize it, wasn't just stacked. It was grown, each stone bonded to the next at the magical level, the way bone knits when it heals. This wasn't going to be a building. It was going to be a living thing. 4 people stood at 4 separate points around the construction, each of them directing work with a focus so absolute Harry initially thought they hadn't noticed him. They had noticed him. The one who moved first was the one to the west, a man roughly Harry's height but built like someone had carved him out of something that didn't bend, broad through the shoulders, with red gold hair that suggested Viking ancestry and a face that suggested he'd already had this fight and won. He wore armor that wasn't decorative, a sword at his hip that wasn't ceremonial, and he moved across the clearing toward Harry with the particular gait of a man who had never once in his life walked away from something. "You," he said, in a voice like gravel deciding to become thunder, came from the forest. "The forest has a ward. How did you pass the ward?" His English was accented but intelligible, older phrasing, vowels shaped differently, but Harry could follow it the way he could follow a Scots accent or a thick West Country drawl. He filed that information away. "I didn't know there was a ward," Harry said honestly. That apparently wasn't the right answer, because the man's hand went to his sword. "Godric." This was from the South Point, a woman's voice, measured and cool. She was walking toward them at a pace that suggested she wasn't concerned but intended to be involved. Dark hair, angular features, blue-gray eyes that were already doing something Harry recognized, cataloging. Taking him apart and putting him back together to see how he worked. She wore robes, deep blue, with a circlet at her brow that caught the light oddly, like it wasn't quite made of any one material. "Let him speak." He spoke. "Godric, Godric," Harry's brain said, with the slow momentum of something very large beginning to move, and didn't answer. He answered honestly. She stopped beside Godric and looked at Harry with those cataloging eyes. "You came through the ward without triggering it, which means either you're more skilled than you look or the magic didn't register you as a threat. Given that you arrived from the direction of the old standing stones, I suspect the latter. Where did you come from?" Harry opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried to think of an answer that was true, wouldn't make him sound unhinged, and also wouldn't get him run through with a sword before he'd figured out when he was. The other 2 founders had arrived during this exchange. He knew them, because of course he knew them. His brain had been making the connections since he'd heard the voice say Godric, and now here they were, all 4, standing in a loose semicircle around him in the mud at the edge of their not-yet castle, and Harry was absolutely certain of 2 things. 1, that this was the most significant moment in magical history he was accidentally standing in, and 2, that if he said anything stupid in the next 30 seconds he might not survive to have any more moments at all. Helga Hufflepuff was shorter than he'd expected and immediately warmer than the situation warranted, a round, sun-browned face with dark eyes that were already softer toward him than either Godric's suspicion or Rowena's analysis, though there was a sharpness behind the warmth that said don't mistake kind for easy. She carried no weapon visible but her hands were moving in small, unconscious gestures that Harry recognized as someone keeping magic ready without committing to a spell. Salazar Slytherin stood slightly apart from the other 3, which Harry suspected was habitual. He was lean where Godric was broad, precise where Godric was overwhelming. Dark eyes, sallow skin, hair worn back, an expression that was carefully neutral in a way that required effort. He was watching Harry with the concentrated stillness of a snake that had spotted something it hadn't decided about yet. And then he looked at the time-turner fused to Harry's wrist, and something shifted in his expression, recognition, or the ghost of it. "The stones," Salazar said, quietly. "He came through the old stones." That's not possible, Rowena said, but the tone meant explain why it's possible rather than I reject this information. The temporal markers on those stones have been active for 3 days, Salazar said. He looked at Harry steadily. Something was supposed to come through them. We assumed it was another of Aldrich's provocations. He paused. It seems we were wrong. Harry was still processing the sentence. Temporal markers have been active for 3 days when Godric stepped forward and got his face very close to Harry's and said, "Who sent you?" The question was asked in the tone of a man who intended to know the answer by any means available. Harry, who had been interrogated by Death Eaters and Voldemort himself and one very persistent ministry official named Dawlish, met his eyes without flinching. No one sent me. And I'd back up a step if I were you, not because I'm threatening you, but because you're standing close enough that if I have to defend myself you'll be the first one hit and I'd rather not start whatever this is with you injured. Complete silence. Godric stared at him. Then he did something Harry hadn't expected, he laughed. It was a full, genuine sound, surprised out of him, and it transformed his face from something threatening into something that was almost boyish despite the armor and the sword and the probably medieval everything else. Back up a step, he repeated, like he was tasting the words. I have not been told to back up a step by someone who didn't immediately regret it. Give him a moment, Rowena said drily. He may yet regret it. He won't, Helga said, with the certainty of a woman who had decided something and didn't revisit decisions. She moved forward past Godric in a way that was somehow both gentle and completely authoritative, and looked at Harry's wrist, at the fused chain and the cracked glass. Her expression flickered. That's old magic. Very old. She looked up at him. How long have you had it? About 20 minutes, Harry said. It wasn't mine. I was studying it and it brought me here. Brought, Rowena repeated. Not drove. Not dragged. Brought, Harry confirmed, because that was the honest word. It had brought him. Like it had somewhere to be and had decided he was the vehicle. Rowena and Salazar exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. What year, Salazar said, addressing Harry directly for the first time, do you come from? Harry told him. The number. No one spoke for a moment. That's, Helga began. Nearly 1,000 years, Rowena said, and she sounded, for the first time, like something had genuinely surprised her. Almost exactly. The resonance pattern, Salazar said, more to himself than any of them. The stones don't reach randomly. There's a mathematical precision to the range. I assumed it was limited to decades. He was looking at Harry now with an expression that had shifted from neutral to something more complicated. Hunger wasn't the right word, but appetite for understanding was in the neighborhood. 1,000 years. How is magic practiced, in your time? Harry blinked. Wands, mostly. Spells. Schools. He paused. There's a school, actually. That I went to. Built on this, he stopped. Looked at the rising walls, at the 4 of them standing in the mud at the center of it. Built here. He exhaled slowly. Right here. Another silence. Heavier than the last one. Godric looked at the half-built walls. Looked back at Harry. It stands. Still. It's the most famous magical school in Britain, Harry said. Godric looked at Rowena with an expression that was almost embarrassingly transparent, the pure, unguarded pleasure of a man hearing that something he'd made had lasted. Rowena's response was cooler but her chin lifted slightly, involuntarily. Famous, she said. For what? Education, Harry said. But also, a lot of other things. It has a tendency to attract conflict. He paused. And students who get into trouble. You were one of those students, Helga said, and it wasn't a question. I had my moments. She smiled at him, warm and immediate. Then she turned to the other 3 and said, in a tone that neatly closed the debate before it could begin, he stays. We'll know more when we know more, and he can't go back yet regardless, the stones won't cycle for weeks. He stays. Godric looked like he wanted to argue. He looked at Harry instead, that assessing look a fighter gave another fighter when trying to take an accurate measure. Can you fight? Yes, Harry said. Prove it. Godric, Helga began. No, let him. Rowena's voice held a note of genuine interest. I want to see what 1,000 years of magical development looks like in practice. Harry looked at Godric and understood what this was, not a threat, not a test of character, but the only language the man spoke fluently. Trust was earned in this world through the body, through capability, through standing in front of something dangerous and not breaking. He could work with that. Fine, Harry said. What are the rules? First yield or incapacitation, Godric said. He drew no weapon. His wand, longer than Harry's, made of something dark, carved with runes along the handle, appeared from his belt. No rules on spellcasting. Anything you know. Anything I know, Harry repeated. All right. Fair warning, some of it won't look like what you're used to. Godric smiled like Christmas had come. Good. The duel lasted 4 minutes, which Harry gathered from the expressions of the other 3 founders was considerably longer than anyone had lasted against Godric in recent memory. Harry had fought Death Eaters at 15, Voldemort at 17, and spent 2 years after the war in intensive training with Aurors who were specifically instructed to be merciless because Kingsley had said the next time won't have a prophecy to help you, Potter. He fought clean and he fought mean and he fought with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned that showing off in a fight was how you ended up dead. Godric was extraordinary. He was fast in a way that shouldn't have been possible for a man his size, his spellwork aggressive and instinctual, and he carried the sword as a genuine extension of his magic rather than a separate tool. The blade was spelled, Harry could feel it, enchanted to deflect certain classes of charm, which meant every time he tried to go around with a disarming spell Godric's blade came up and took the hit instead. His shield work was different too, more active than reactive, less a barrier and more a weapon that happened to be shaped like protection. Harry stopped trying to disarm him in the first 30 seconds and switched to terrain. The clearing was uneven, full of those fresh-cut stumps and loose stones from the construction. Harry used all of it, conjuring cover, forcing angles, using a wall charm not to block Godric but to redirect the man's advance and put a stump at the back of his heel. Godric hit it, caught himself, and Harry had a stunner in the air before the stumble was complete. Godric took it on the flat of the spelled blade with an expression of pure delight. You don't fight like a duelist, he said. No, Harry agreed, circling. I fight like someone who needs to win. Godric's next volley came faster, 3 spells so tightly sequenced they read as one, and Harry went under all 3 with a dive that turned into a roll and came up casting Confringo at the ground between them, not at Godric, but at the ground, a concussive burst that threw mud and stone in a wave. While Godric's shield went up to handle the debris, Harry was already moving to his flank. The stunner that caught Godric was not powerful. It didn't need to be. It was just cast from 3 feet to his right while his attention was forward. Godric went down. He was back on his feet in 4 seconds. The man had the constitution of something geological, blinking the stun days away, and he looked at Harry with an expression that had moved well past assessment into something that might have been genuine respect. You hit me from the flank, he said. You were watching the center, Harry said. You have a tendency to go straight. It's effective about 90% of the time, which makes the other 10% predictable. Godric absorbed this. Then he smiled, different from the earlier smile, fuller, the smile of a man who'd been given a real gift. I've told Rowena for 3 years that I needed someone to tell me what I'm doing wrong. I didn't say it was wrong, Harry said. I said it was predictable. Against me. Against most opponents it would work fine. He's diplomatic, Helga observed. I like him. He's strategic, Rowena said, and she was looking at Harry in a new way, with the particular focus of someone who had found something worth studying. There's a difference. Salazar had said nothing through all of this. He was leaning against a half-built wall with his arms crossed, watching Harry with those dark, careful eyes. When Harry looked at him, he didn't look away. "Parseltongue," Salazar said quietly. "Just the word." Harry went still. Salazar's eyes moved to Harry's hand, the wand hand, the arm with the time-turner fused to it. "The markings on your skin," he said. "The old word for time magic, in the eldest tongue." A pause. "The language of serpents has words for deep time. Words most speakers don't know exist." He tilted his head. "Do you speak it?" Harry looked at him steadily and answered in Parseltongue, "Yes." The sound of it rippled through the clearing. Helga's eyes went wide. Godric's hand moved instinctively toward his sword before he stopped himself. Rowena went very, very still, the way a mind goes still when it's processing something that rewrites a previous assumption. Salazar straightened from the wall. For the first time something moved in his face that wasn't controlled, something that was, Harry thought, close to relief. "In my time," Harry said in English, "Parseltongue was considered a dark mark. Something inherited from a dark wizard." He paused. "I inherited it from someone I had to kill. In the end, though, it was just a language. It was never what they said it was." Salazar looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "It never was." Helga was the one who finally moved, stepping forward with a practicality that cut through the charged atmosphere like a warm knife. "Supper will be getting cold," she said, "and I for one intend to have supper before we have another conversation about magic, ancient or otherwise." She looked at Harry with that straightforward warmth. "Come on, then. You must be hungry." Harry realized, quite suddenly, that he was starving. They ate around a fire that Helga had built with wood and her hands before anyone could offer a spell, which Harry filed under things that tell you everything about a person. She cooked with magic so casual and so ancient that Harry could barely recognize the spells, things that weren't quite transfiguration and weren't quite charms but were something underneath both of them, foundational, like cooking magic had existed before the categories had been invented to contain it. The food was extraordinary. He didn't ask what most of it was. He ate all of it. The camp around the construction site was more substantial than he'd noticed from the tree lean, tents that were larger inside than out, a working forge, a library that appeared to be housed in what looked from the outside like a garden shed and from the inside like a building that had stopped pretending physics applied to it. Workers, witches and wizards, young and older, some barely adults, moved through the camp with the purposeful energy of people who had bought entirely into a shared vision. "How many?" Harry asked Helga quietly, watching them. 37 at present. More coming. Word travels." She was quiet for a moment, turning something on the fire. "It's not just the four of us. It never was. We just began it." She said this in the tone of someone correcting a misconception before it could become a myth. "That's not how the story gets told," Harry said. She smiled, eyes on the fire. "No. I imagine not. Stories like large shapes. They round the edges." She looked at him. "What do they say? About us? If it's not, I don't need to know if it's unkind." "It's not unkind," Harry said. "They say four of the greatest witches and wizards of the age came together to build a school. They say you each had a different philosophy about magic and those philosophies became four houses, for ways of teaching." He paused. "They say," he stopped. "Go on," she said gently. "They say it ended badly. The four of you." He kept his voice neutral. "That Salazar left. That there was disagreement. About who should be taught." Helga was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. "Yes," she said finally. "That sounds like where we're heading." She didn't sound defeated. She sounded tired, and sad, and like a woman who had been watching a storm build on the horizon for a long time. "Salazar's not wrong about everything, you know. That's the hardest part. If he were simply wrong, it would be simple. But he sees things the rest of us don't want to see, and that makes him angry, and when he's angry he says things that are, she shook her head. Well. He says things. What does he see that you don't? That the world outside these walls isn't going to love what we're building, she said simply. That some people are going to fight it. Hard. A pause. He's not wrong about that. He's wrong about what it means. He thinks it means we should control the doors. I think it means we should build the walls stronger. Harry absorbed that. Aldrich, he said, because that name had been circling his thoughts since Salazar had mentioned it. Helga's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. You heard that. I hear most things in a crisis. Aldrich is, she chose her words carefully. He's of the old tradition. Before schools. Before structure. He believes that magic belongs wild, unteachable, that institutionalizing it kills something essential. She paused. He's been watching us build for a month. He's done nothing yet. Which worries me more than if he'd done something. A man who waits is a man with a plan, Harry said. Exactly. She looked at him with something that was new in her expression, not warm this time, but considering, careful. What kind of man are you, Harry Potter? You came here by accident, you say. But you speak the old language, you fight like someone trained by war, not study, and you know things about us that no one should know for another 1,000 years. She paused. What kind of accident is that? Harry looked at the fire for a long moment. The kind I've spent my whole life having, he said honestly. I've never once arrived somewhere useful by design. It's always been, he spread his hands. This. And yet you keep landing on your feet, she said. Mostly, Harry said. Sometimes on my face. But yeah, mostly. She laughed, a real one, full and warm, and the tension around the fire eased in a way that seemed to spread outward, because Godric looked up from across the flames and whatever argument he'd been conducting at low volume with Rowena paused, and even Salazar, alone at the edge of the firelight, uncrossed his arms fractionally. Rowena looked at Harry from across the fire with those analytical eyes. I want to examine the time turner tomorrow, she said. Not asked. Stated. With your cooperation. Fine, Harry said. And I want to ask you questions. About spells. About development. About, Rowena, Helga said. Tomorrow, Rowena finished, smoothly. I'll save them for tomorrow. All of them? Harry asked. No, she admitted. Not all of them. I don't expect to run out of questions. Neither do I, Harry said, and the corner of Rowena's mouth moved, just slightly, in what might eventually become a smile if it kept growing in that direction. Godric stretched his arms over his head, the full wingspan of someone who took up space as a matter of course, and looked at Harry with something that had settled into uncomplicated pleasure. You fight well for someone from the future, he said. You fight well for someone who telegraphs his right, Harry said. Godric pointed at him. I'm going to fix that. You're going to help me. I thought I might, Harry said. And in return, Godric said, settling back, I'll teach you what real magic looks like. Before it got, he waved a hand. Whatever it became. Structured, Rowena said. Tamed, Salazar said, from the dark edge of the firelight. Shared, Helga said quietly, and that word had a different weight than all the others. Harry looked around the fire at 4 people who were going to build something that would still be standing when he was born, who were going to argue and eventually break apart, who were going to write their disagreements into the architecture of the thing they made and leave them there for 1,000 years. He thought about the castle still going up behind them, stone by stone, growing from bedrock. He thought about the great hall, the moving staircases, the classroom where he'd first made something happen with a wand. He thought, I grew up inside what you're building right now, and I have no idea how to tell you that. Tomorrow, he said, and let the fire say the rest. He was given a tent on the eastern edge of the camp, near enough to the construction site that he could hear the faint background hum of the foundational magic even through the canvas walls. He lay on the bedroll they'd given him and stared at the tent ceiling and thought very carefully about his situation. Stuck. Probably weeks, if Salazar's assessment of the standing stones was accurate. No ministry, no Hermione, no way home before the stones cycled. He'd been carried 1,000 years into the past and left in a forest with 4 of the most powerful magical practitioners who had ever lived, building the school that had shaped every witch and wizard Harry had ever known. He could do worse. He turned his wrist and looked at the time turner in the low light, the cracked glass, the still amber sand. The runes on the chain had been glowing faintly since he'd arrived, not alarmingly, just steadily, like something that had reached its destination and was satisfied. Where it wanted to go, he thought. Or where my magic called it. What did that mean? His magic had been exhausted, stretched, modified by years of combat and grief and the particular education the war had given him. What part of him, what need, what unresolved question, would have called him to this, of all places? He thought about the first time he'd walked through the doors of Hogwarts. 11 years old, nobody's child, astonished that somewhere like this could exist, could have existed the whole time he'd been sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs. The feeling of it. The specific shape of that feeling, like coming home to somewhere you'd never been. He pressed the cracked glass of the time turner against his palm and felt it warm. Maybe it wasn't complicated, in the end. Maybe the magic was simpler than the theory, maybe it had just brought him to the beginning of the thing he loved most in the world. Outside, the half-built castle hummed in the dark, growing slowly upward, and somewhere beyond the tree leaned something that might have been an owl or might have been something else entirely moved through the ancient canopy, and Harry closed his eyes and let the sound of building lull him toward the closest thing to peace he'd felt in years. He was awake when something passed over the ward at the forest's edge, awake and on his feet with his wand in his hand before he'd consciously processed what had woken him. Whatever it was didn't come closer. It moved parallel to the camp's border, slow and deliberate, like something that was measuring. Making assessments. Taking note of where people were and what they had. Harry stood in the dark of his tent and felt it pass and felt it leave, and thought about what Helga had said, a man who waits is a man with a plan. He didn't go back to sleep for a long time. But when he did, it was with his wand in his hand and a monitoring charm set at the tree lean, and the deep residual hum of Hogwarts Foundation magic rising through the ground beneath him, ancient and certain and already more permanent than anything that had tried to stop it. He slept. And the castle grew. Chapter 2, Earth and Iron Dawn came to the construction site the way it came to all wild places, without asking permission. Harry was already up. He'd reset his monitoring charm twice in the night, both times finding nothing at the tree lean except wind and the particular quality of silence that old forests had, a silence with texture to it, full of small movements and breath. Whatever had been out there measuring them hadn't come back. That bothered him more than if it had. He spent the first gray hour of morning walking the perimeter of the camp. Not patrolling, he didn't have that authority and he wasn't going to assume it, but looking. Mapping. The war had taught him that the first thing you did in any new space was understand its vulnerabilities, the places where a threat could enter unannounced, the angles that couldn't be watched from the center. The camp had good bones. Helga's ward was impressive, layered in ways that suggested someone who understood that magical intrusion rarely came from one direction. But there were gaps, not careless ones, but gaps born of assumption, places where the wards thinned because the builders believed the forest itself was protection enough. He made mental notes. Said nothing yet, because he'd been here 12 hours and earning the right to suggest changes to someone's ward structure took longer than 12 hours. The forge was already lit when he passed it, worked by a broad-shouldered woman with close-cropped gray hair who looked at him with the blank appraisal of someone entirely comfortable with her own importance and entirely indifferent to his. He nodded. She went back to whatever she was making. He respected that. The eastern tower was 2 stories now, going up faster than should have been physically possible, driven by a rotating crew of workers who spelled stone through the night in shifts. Harry stood at the base of it for a moment and put his hand against the foundation stones. The magic in them was unlike anything he'd felt in the finished castle of his own time, not quieter or louder, but younger, the way a river runs differently close to its source. Active. Still becoming what it would eventually be. You feel it. He turned. Helga was 10 feet behind him with 2 clay mugs and the expression of someone who had been up longer than he had. She held one out. He took it. Hot, dark, herbed in a way that wasn't quite tea and wasn't quite anything else, but was warming in a manner that reached somewhere behind his sternum and stayed there. Yes, he said. It's different from how I know it. The castle in my time, this magic is older. Deeper. It should be the same magic, she said, looking at the tower. It will be. Time changes things the way water changes stone, slowly, invisibly, until one day the shape is something you don't recognize. She drank from her mug. What you felt in the future, does it feel diminished? Or just different? Harry thought about the feeling of Hogwarts in his own time. The warmth of the entrance hall, the particular responsiveness of the walls during moments of need, the room of requirement, the portraits, the way the castle knew when something was wrong. Not diminished, he said honestly. Richer, maybe. It's had 1,000 years of people putting themselves into it. Helga made a sound that might have been satisfaction. Good. That's what it's supposed to do. She tilted her head toward the open ground beyond the tower. Come on. You said you wanted to learn. When did I say that? Last night, when Godric offered to show you old magic. She started walking. You agreed. Which means you want to learn. You just haven't said what. She glanced back at him. What do you want to learn? Harry followed her. What are you offering? Foundation work, she said simply. Not spells. Not the things you throw at people. The other kind. She stopped in the middle of the open ground, planted her feet, and looked at him. How did you learn to cast? School. School, then, circumstances. Circumstances meaning you were in danger. Frequently. She nodded like this confirmed something. Then you learned magic the way most people learn it now, by being given shapes to trace. Someone showed you the wand movement, told you the word, you repeated until it worked. She paused. Yes. More or less. And did anyone ever show you why it works? Not the theory of it, not charms theory or transfiguration principles, but the actual reason. What the magic is doing when you cast. Harry opened his mouth. Closed it. He thought about Hermione's meticulous notes on spell mechanics, thought about Professor Flitwick explaining the wrist motion for Wingardium Leviosa, thought about the hours in the room of requirement working through Dumbledore's army and never once, not once, thinking about what the magic was actually doing below the level of the visible spell. No, he said. Helga looked unsurprised. Put your wand away, she said. He did. She crouched down and pressed both palms flat against the earth, fingers spread. She stayed like that for a moment, and Harry watched the grass around her hands change, not dramatically, not in the way a spell changed things, but the way things change when something very patient and very large breathes through them. The ground seemed to settle under her hands, the way a horse settles when a rider it trusts takes the reins. Everything you cast goes through the earth, she said, without looking up. Every spell, every charm, every curse. You may throw it upward, sideways, at a target in front of you, but the source is here. The magic comes up through you from the world, travels through your intent, and becomes whatever shape you've learned to give it. The wand is a direction device, not a source. The words are memory aids, not commands. She looked up at him. Your wand is a good one, I can tell that from watching you last night. There's a genuine resonance there, but you're using it as a crutch. You're putting it between yourself and the magic instead of letting it be a conduit. Harry stared at her. That's not how any of my teachers ever described it. No, she said. Because most of your teachers were also taught by teachers who'd forgotten. She stood. Try something. Simplest thing you know. He held his hand out, wand in his pocket, and thought Lumos. Nothing happened. He tried harder, tried to feel it, tried to find the connection she was describing. Nothing. You're reaching for it, Helga said. Stop reaching. You don't reach for your heartbeat. She put 2 fingers lightly on his wrist, over his pulse. Feel that? It's not something you do. You just are it. She stepped back. Magic is the same. You're not reaching for it. You're just allowing it to move. Harry stood in the morning light and tried to understand the difference between reaching and allowing, which felt initially like the kind of distinction that existed only in the minds of people who'd never needed magic to work right now when everything was on fire. But he closed his eyes and stopped trying and instead just stood there. Breathed. Felt his heartbeat. Felt his feet on the ground and then, below that, the ground continuing downward, rock and root and the dark heavy presence of deep earth, and below that something that wasn't a feeling he had a word for, something that was there the way the sun was there even when you couldn't see it. Light bloomed in his palm. No wand. No word. Just light, warmer and more golden than Lumos had ever been, pooling in his open hand like something had poured it there. He opened his eyes and looked at it. Oh, he said, somewhat inadequately. Helga smiled. Not smug, genuinely pleased, in the way teachers were pleased when they saw someone understand something real. That's what magic feels like without the crutch, she said. Now. We spend the morning learning to walk on your own 2 feet. Then this afternoon we'll put the wand back and see what the difference is. She settled back onto the ground, cross-legged. Sit down. Harry sat. The light in his palm guttered, caught itself, steadied. Tell me about the spell you used last night, she said. The one that hit the ground instead of Godric. The explosion. Confringo. Blasting charm. What does it feel like when you cast it? Like pressure. Like something building behind the sternum and then releasing. She nodded. And this? She gestured at the light in his hand. Like it was always there, Harry said. Like I just stopped blocking it. Yes, Helga said. That's the difference. When you throw a blasting charm, you're compressing magic into a shape and forcing it out. Efficient in combat. Inefficient in almost every other context. She paused. You fight beautifully, Harry. But you've learned to survive in a world that required you to weaponize everything you touched. What I'm teaching you is the part before the weapon. The part before the shape. She met his eyes. Can you do that? Learn to unlearn something. Learn to have something you didn't know was missing. He held the light in his hand and thought about what the war had cost, not in people, though that list was long and specific and lived in him like embedded splinters, but in the kind of wizard it had made him. Reactive. Combat ready. Perpetually braced. Everything a tool, everything assessed for tactical value. He'd had 3 years of peace and he was still doing it, still walking into rooms and clocking exits, still holding his wand too tight, still waking up when something moved at the tree line. Yeah, he said quietly. I can do that. They worked through the morning with no wands and no words, and Harry's frustration mounted and broke and mounted again in waves that Helga navigated with the patience of someone who had done this before and expected exactly this response. The exercises weren't physical, exactly, but they were embodied, rooted in the sensation of connection with the ground, with the air, with the ambient magic of the forest surrounding the camp. Helga called it listening work, and she meant it literally. You sat, or stood, or moved, and you listened to the magic the way you listen to a conversation already in progress that you just walked into. You didn't speak yet. You got the shape of it first. Harry was good at some of it. The war had made him acutely sensitive to changes in magical atmosphere, the way the air felt different when a ward was strained, the particular pressure that preceded a large spell, the physical sensation of a person suppressing or releasing strong magic. Those instincts were exactly what Helga was refining, pulling them from the context of danger where he developed them and setting them down in peace, which turned out to be harder than it sounded. He was poor at the stillness parts. His mind kept moving. He'd get the sensation of deep earth, that enormous patient presence, and then a thought would cross, the time-turner's cracked glass, the thing moving at the tree lean last night, Salazar's face when he'd heard the parcel tongue, and the connection would thin and he'd have to rebuild it. Your mind moves like water on a slope, Helga observed, after the fourth rebuild. That's a polite way to say I can't concentrate. It's an accurate way to say your mind prefers to be in motion. She wasn't critical. That's not a fault. Motion is how you've survived. It just means we teach you to anchor, not to be still. Water on a slope doesn't stop, it finds a basin. She tapped the ground. Find the basin. He tried again. This time he didn't try to stop the motion, let his thoughts move and moved with them, stayed with the physical sensation of the earth beneath him, and found that if he let the thoughts run over the surface without following them, the connection underneath stayed open, consistent, like a river with a current and a riverbed, both moving and grounded. The light that bloomed in his palm the third time was bright enough that two workers nearby stopped to look. There, Helga said, quietly satisfied. Godric arrived at midday with the announcement that there would be no rest on account of the fact that he had identified 3 defensive weaknesses in Harry's fighting style during their duel and intended to address them before sundown. There's only one, Harry said, without looking up from his lunch. Godric sat down across from him with the practiced ease of a man who fit into any seat as though it had been built for him. 3, he said. You leave your left open when you're circling. You commit too hard to terrain manipulation. If I'd kicked the stump clear you'd have had to restructure your entire approach. And you watched my sword too much. I noticed you tracking it. That's a habit, I had it once. Cost me a split lip and a broken tooth. Harry considered this. The left is deliberate, he said. I watch whether people go for it. If they do, they've committed to the right side and I have them. Godric paused. You were baiting me. I was baiting you. A slow smile spread across Godric's face. Clever, he admitted. I went for it. You went for it beautifully. You're fast, I barely got the stunner off in time. Godric pointed at him again with one finger, a gesture Harry was gathering he used as punctuation. I want that. The baiting. He sat back. I fight better than most because I'm faster than most and my power is substantial. I haven't had to learn subtlety because I haven't needed it. That works fine until you meet someone equally powerful who's also subtle, Harry said. Which I apparently have done. How'd that go for you? Harry said, and he kept his voice perfectly neutral, but something in his face must have shifted because Godric stared at him for a moment and then started laughing again, that full, unguarded sound, and Harry found himself smiling despite everything. I'm going to like you, Godric said, with the conviction of a man making a decree. I've decided. I'm flattered. You should be. I've decided I like maybe 6 people in the world. Who are the other 5? Godric's expression shifted, became something more complex. He glanced toward where Helga was directing 2 young workers in some kind of levitation sequence, toward the top of the eastern tower where Rowena was a distant figure against the sky, toward, briefly, carefully, the direction of Salazar's tent. You'd know them, he said simply. You said you know us. I know what history kept, Harry said. That's different. Godric looked at him for a long moment. What does history keep of me? Harry thought about it honestly. Courage, he said. Nerve and chivalry. The idea that bravery is the most important thing. That the willingness to face the dangerous thing is what separates those who change the world from those who watch it change. He paused. One of the houses, yours, sends out more heroes than any other. More aurors. More defenders. More people who run toward trouble instead of away. He paused again. More people who die young. Godric was quiet for a moment. And you, he said. Your house. Mine too, Harry said. Godric looked at him steadily. Are you proud of that? Yes and no, Harry said honestly. I'm proud of what the bravery stood for. I'm less sure anyone ever taught us when not to be brave. When to think instead of charge. He met Godric's eyes. Not everything should be faced head-on. Sometimes the thing you need to face is inside you, and charging at it just breaks you without fixing anything. A long pause. Rowena would say that, Godric said finally. Maybe Rowena's right about some things, Harry said. Godric's jaw worked. She usually is, he admitted, with the air of a man handing over something he'd rather have kept. Don't tell her I said so. She'll work it out herself, Harry said. She usually does. The afternoon combat session was nothing like the previous night's duel. Godric didn't come at him with power. He came at him with patience, or his version of patience, which was aggressive and loud and involved a lot of circling and the particular energy of a very large man trying to learn a new mode of being. Harry walked him through baiting techniques, the art of manufacturing predictability in your movement so that your opponent's reaction becomes the exploit, the specific discipline of watching everything except the obvious threat so that you always knew where the sword was through peripheral awareness while your eyes stayed on the face. The face tells you what the body hasn't done yet, Harry said. I watch your eyes. About 2 counts before you commit hard to a direction, your eyes flick that way. Just once. Fast. But it's there. Godric looked genuinely startled. I didn't know I did that. Most people don't know their tells. That's what makes them tells. They sparred slowly, working the technique at half speed so the habit could be examined rather than just executed, and Harry found something in Godric that he hadn't expected, a genuine hunger for this, for the examination of his own craft, for improvement not as ego but as purpose. Godric fought because fighting was the most honest language he had, Harry realized. When he fought someone seriously and engaged, he was expressing something he couldn't say otherwise, attention, respect, the particular intimacy of real effort. It reminded Harry of someone. He tried not to think about who. Rowena appeared at the edge of the training ground at mid-afternoon, her circlet in her hands rather than at her brow, which Harry had noticed seemed to be how she indicated she was in a mode of inquiry rather than authority. She watched them work for a while, and then, the technique you're teaching him. The eye movement reading. That's behavioral analysis of motor preparation. Where did you learn it? A woman named Moody, Harry said. Well, sort of. It's complicated. From his memories, mostly. Memories, Rowena said. You learn from someone's memories. It's possible, in my time. To access certain kinds of memories. It's called a pensieve, a stone basin, enchanted to hold memories externally so they can be revisited or shared. Rowena was very still in the way she got when something had landed in her mind and was being rapidly processed. A permanent external memory store, she murmured. Revisitable. Observable by outside parties. She looked at Harry. How is it indexed? It's not, really. You pour the memory in and it sorts itself, to a degree. But retrieval is manual. You go in looking for something and you have to navigate the memory as it was experienced. You can't search it like a text. What if you could? She said it absently, still processing, and Harry recognized the look. He'd seen Hermione wear it, the expression of someone who had just found the edge of a problem they intended to solve. That's actually how the Great Library works, he said, before he could stop himself. Rowena's eyes snapped to his. What Great Library? He hadn't meant to say that. There's a room in the school. In my time. That holds a kind of structured magical knowledge archive. I think it must have been developed from an early version of the pensieve concept. He was being deliberately vague because the last thing he wanted was to start accidentally inventing or accelerating things that should develop on their own timeline. Rowena looked at him with the expression of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "You're being careful about what you tell me." "Yes." "Good," she said, unexpectedly. "That's the right instinct." She settled the circlet back at her brow. "I'm going to ask you questions about magic that are theoretical rather than historical. Your own knowledge, what you yourself understand, not what you've read or been told. Is that acceptable?" "Why that distinction?" "Because what you know is yours. What you've been told belongs to people who haven't been born yet and whose work I shouldn't receive by accident." She looked at him evenly. "There's an ethics to this, Harry. Information from the future is not a resource to be mined." Harry stared at her. Yes. Absolutely. He'd honestly not thought it through that clearly. "Thank you that's exactly right." The corner of her mouth moved. That almost smile again. "Come find me at the library after supper," she said. "We'll talk about what you know." Supper that evening was interrupted. They heard the sound first, a deep, irregular percussion like a very large drum being played wrong, coming from the western forest. The workers stopped eating. Harry was on his feet with his wand out before the second beat, old instinct, and he registered that Godric had his sword already drawn on the other side of the fire and Salazar had materialized from somewhere with a stillness that suggested he'd been expecting something. "Ward pressure," Helga said, and her voice was different. All the warmth was still there, but underneath it was something that was neither warm nor cold but simply solid, ancient as the earth she'd been teaching Harry about. She had both hands raised, palms out. "Western boundary. Something is pushing." "How much something?" Godric asked. "One," she said. "One person. But the pressure they're generating," her hands pressed forward fractionally. "That's not one person's worth of strength." Harry watched the tree lean and felt the ward under his feet, now that Helga had spent a morning teaching him to feel it. She was right, the pressure was enormous, singular, dense in a way that didn't feel quite like human magic. Not darker, exactly. Older. Like the difference between a forged sword and an obsidian blade, different processes, different properties, nothing inherently one better than the other, but incompatible in some fundamental way with what had been built here. "Aldrich," Salazar said, from Harry's left. A figure emerged from the tree lean. He was older than Harry had expected, not elderly but seasoned, mid-50s perhaps, though age was hard to read in a man who carried himself the way this one did, which was with the complete physical authority of someone who had been the most dangerous thing in every room he'd ever entered and had stopped noticing. He was tall, heavy-shouldered, wearing rough practical clothes with no ornamentation except a staff he carried in one hand, gnarled wood, dark, carved or grown into a spiral along its length, and Harry's magic sense hit it and staggered slightly because the power held in that staff was substantial. Not structured the way wand magic was structured. Not channeled. Just, held, the way a dam holds water, pressing at its own container. He stopped at the ward boundary and looked across the camp with gray eyes that moved slowly, taking inventory. When they reached Harry they paused. "New one," he said. His voice was deep and very calm, the calm of something that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. "Where'd you find him, Hufflepuff?" "He found himself," Helga said pleasantly. "What do you want, Aldrich?" "To talk." He raised his chin toward the half-built castle. "You've gotten further than I thought you would. The foundation work is good. Whoever did the bedrock bonding understands anchoring magic." His eyes moved to Helga, acknowledging her work with the reluctant precision of a man incapable of not recognizing competence even when he resented what it was building. "Waste of it," he said. "You've come 3 miles through an old forest to tell us it's a waste," Godric said. He had his sword out but low, which Harry recognized as deliberate, visible but not threatening, the weapon position of a man who wanted his opponent to know exactly how fast things could change without making them change yet. "You could have sent a bird." "I don't send birds," Aldrich said. He stepped to the ward boundary and stopped there, and the pressure Harry could feel through his feet increased marginally, not hostile, but present, the way a large animal makes its presence felt without moving. I came to tell you what I told the man Gryffindor's father when he built the first holding school and what I'll tell whoever comes after you. You are not preserving magic by teaching it. You are taming it. Naming it. Reducing the infinite to a curriculum. He looked at the walls. Magic was old before your grandparents' drew breath. It is bigger than every theory you have ever written. You build walls around it and call it education, and in 1,000 years no one will remember what wild magic felt like, and that will be your legacy. Silence. The fire crackled. The ward hummed. Harry, who had spent the morning learning to feel the ground beneath his feet and had found magic older and more enormous than anything he'd been taught to name, said nothing. Because Aldrich wasn't entirely wrong. He could feel that. The way you could feel when someone wrong was saying something true. You speak as though wild and taught are opposites, Rowena said from his right. She'd come up quietly, which Harry was gathering was her preferred mode in most situations. They aren't. Teaching structure doesn't destroy wildness. It gives wildness direction. A river isn't less powerful for having banks, it's more powerful, because the water is going somewhere. A river with banks is not a river, Aldrich said. It's a canal. That's poetic, Rowena said. It's also wrong. You're arguing from nostalgia, not evidence. Aldrich's grey eyes moved to Harry again. He had the focused quality of a man who found the most interesting thing in a room and pointed himself at it. You, he said. You're new. You're not of their generation, and you're not of this place. I can smell the temporal dislocation on you like old smoke. He tilted his head. What do you think of their project? Every head in the camp turned toward Harry. He thought for a moment. Didn't look to any of the 4 founders for guidance. Thought honestly, because this man would know if he were being given a performance, and also because Harry had never once managed to be dishonest under genuine direct pressure. I think it worked, he said. I grew up in it. In what they built, 1,000 years from now. And it wasn't a canal. He met Aldrich's grey eyes. It was enormous and wild and complicated and full of magic I never understood, and I learned things there that I never could have learned alone, because I had teachers, and I had other students, and together we were bigger than any one of us. He paused. I also think you're not entirely wrong. Structure has a cost. Naming has a cost. But what you're proposing isn't a solution to that cost, it's just deciding the thing shouldn't exist. And it should. He looked at the half-built walls. It really, genuinely should. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. His eyes stayed on Harry with a quality that was measuring something deeper than combat or politics, something personal. 1,000 years, he said softly. Yes. And what does wild magic look like, in 1,000 years? In your time? Harry thought about that honestly. About Hagrid's creatures, the Whomping Willow, the forest, the magic that existed in the seams of the world where ministry regulation hadn't quite reached. Smaller than it was, he admitted. Pushed back. Not gone, but smaller. And I don't know how much of that is the school's fault and how much is just, time, and people, and the world getting more full. Aldrich nodded once, slowly. Honest, he said. I'll give you that. He looked at the founders one more time, a long slow look that took each of them in separately, and then he turned. I'll come again, he said, over his shoulder, as if it were a courtesy. We'll be here, Helga said. He walked back into the trees and the ward pressure dropped and the amber late light came back and someone, one of the younger workers, let out a long, shaky breath that summarized everyone's feeling better than any articulate statement could have. Godric sheathed his sword. He looked at Harry. That was well said. I meant it, Harry said. I know. Godric picked up his supper, which he'd held throughout the entire encounter without apparently noticing. That's what made it well said. Later, in Rowena's library tent, which was, in the way of most things connected to Rowena Ravenclaw, both more and less than it appeared from the outside, Harry sat across from her at a low table covered in parchment and tried to explain what it had felt like to cast a Patronus for the first time. Rowena's questions were precise in a way that he'd thought would feel clinical but didn't, because the precision was in service of genuine understanding rather than categorization. She wasn't trying to define the Patronus charm. She was trying to understand what Harry experienced when he performed it, and there was a meaningful difference. So the emotion is the engine, she said, not the fuel. Both, Harry said. But, yes, more the engine than the fuel. The happiness isn't what powers it. The happiness is what directs it. The power comes from, he touched the ground. From what Helga showed me this morning. It comes from underneath everything. The happiness is what shapes the opening. Rowena wrote something on her parchment. And the form, she said. The animal form. That's specific to the caster. It doesn't change. Mine's a stag, Harry said. And then, because it would have been odd not to say, my father's was too. Rowena looked up from her parchment. You're telling me a spell exists that expresses the magical signature of an individual caster as an externalized physical form drawn from their deepest positive emotional state. Yes. And someone invented this. Someone did. When? Harry smiled. I genuinely don't know. It's old enough that the textbooks just listed it without origin. Rowena looked at her parchment with an expression that Harry was beginning to recognize as the external sign of an interior storm. Ideas building in there, fast and structural, each one generating the framework for the next. He'd seen it briefly after the pensive comment earlier. Now it was in full force. Could you show me? She said. The spell? Harry pulled his wand out, thought about Ginny's laugh and Ron's terrible chess face and Hermione's insufferable, wonderful, precise voice saying honestly, Harry, thought about the morning he'd woken up for the first time in Grimmauld Place and thought we actually won and felt the specific texture of that relief, deep and enduring and particular, and said, expecto patronum. The stag erupted from the wand tip in silver light, enormous and incandescent, and it moved through the library tent with the unhurried certainty of something that knew exactly how real it was, steam rising from its antlers, head high, and for a moment the silver light of it fell on Rowena Ravenclaw's face and she looked young. For a moment, the composure dropped and she was just someone seeing something extraordinary for the first time. More actions request aborted. Write the next chapter now. The Founding Magic Chapter 3, The Language of Serpents. The snake appeared on the third morning. Harry found it at dawn, coiled around the base of the Eastern Tower's foundation stone like it had grown there overnight, massive, black-scaled, with the particular stillness of something that was awake and watching rather than sleeping. About 8 feet of it was visible. He had no idea how much more was underneath the coil. He crouched down and looked at it. It looked back at him with copper-colored eyes and said, in the flat, carrying tone of something accustomed to being understood, you smell wrong for this time. Why are you here? Accident, Harry said, in the same tongue. Mostly. The snake's tongue tasted the air. Mostly is not entirely. No, Harry agreed. But the part that wasn't accident, I don't understand yet. A long pause. The snake's head moved slightly, a small precise adjustment. You speak the deep tongue without pain. Most speakers of your kind speak it like it costs them something. It used to, Harry said. It doesn't anymore. Why not? He thought about the Horcrux in his skull and the long 7 years of carrying it and then the moment in the forest when it had left him, and what that departure had felt like, not relief, exactly, but the absence of a weight so long held he'd stopped noticing it until it was gone. I stopped carrying the thing that made it hurt, he said. The snake considered this with the patience of something that measured time in seasons rather than minutes. There is a speaker here. The Dark One. He knows I am here. Does he come to talk to you? Every morning. He is. The snake paused, and the pause had a quality to it, waited. He is careful. He knows the deep tongue completely, but he holds himself very still when he speaks it. As if it is something he has learned to be ashamed of. Harry said nothing for a moment. The morning was still pale, the camp just beginning to stir. Would you mind if he knew we'd spoken? I do not mind what humans know of me. I have no politics. A beat. You are interesting, time-wrong speaker. Come again if you wish. It uncoiled from the stone with a liquid ease and disappeared into the long grass beyond the construction, and Harry watched it go and thought about Salazar Slytherin speaking the old tongue with held stillness and the particular loneliness of a language nobody else speaks without fear. He stood up and turned around, and Salazar was standing 10 feet behind him. From his expression, he'd been there long enough. They walked without discussing where they were walking, which seemed to be the way Salazar preferred things. Direction by implication, destination discovered on arrival. He moved with the economic precision of someone who never wasted motion, and he was quiet in a way that was different from Rowena's quiet. Rowena's silence was dense with processing. Salazar's silence was a preference, a chosen state, the quiet of a man who had decided long ago that most conversations weren't worth the energy and had very specific criteria for the ones that were. He led them to the edge of the camp where the tree line thinned and an old stone outcropping made a natural shelf, and he sat on it with his back to the camp, looking at the forest. Harry sat beside him without being asked and looked at the forest too. How long have you spoken it? Salazar said. Since I was 11. Naturally? Or learned? Naturally. I didn't know what it was until someone told me. Harry paused. In my time it's associated with dark magic. With a specific dark wizard. Most Parselmouths in history, apparently, traced their lineage back to him. And yours? Same. I inherited it from him, in a way. Not by blood. By something else. Something he did to me accidentally when I was a child. He looked at his hands. When he died, I thought I'd lose it. But I didn't. It stayed. He paused. I think it was mine before it was his. I think some of us just have it. And he was a reason for me to have it, but not the only possible reason. Salazar was quiet for a moment. In my time, he said, it is considered a mark of distinction. Not universal, some fear it, some distrust it, but among those who understand what it means, it is recognized as a sign of magical depth. An attunement to the oldest forms. He paused, and the pause had a complicated weight. I know what it becomes. I have always known, I think, that perception would shift. That it would come to mean something smaller and uglier than what it is. Does that? Harry stopped. Does it what? Does it factor into what you're building? Harry said carefully. The school. The disagreements. About who should be taught. Salazar looked at him with dark eyes that were very still and very direct. You know the shape of this argument already. From your history. I know one version of it. What version? That you wanted to restrict who could attend. That you believed certain students were undesirable. The word sat in the air between them. Salazar didn't flinch from it. That's the version that survived 1,000 years of retelling, he said. Yes. And in that version I'm the villain, Harry said, because there was no point softening it. You're the reason the school was divided. You're the reason the history of magical education has a wound in it. Your emblem is the symbol dark wizards chose for their movement, centuries after your death, because of what they believed you stood for. He paused. That's the version. Salazar absorbed this without apparent distress, which impressed Harry more than almost anything else he'd seen in the 3 days he'd been here. He was absorbing the information that history had made him the villain of the piece and processing it with the careful analytical stillness of a man who wasn't going to let a reaction happen until he understood what was worth reacting to. What do I actually believe, Salazar said, in this version of events? What is the given reason? Blood purity, Harry said. The belief that only witches and wizards from magical families should be taught. That those born to non-magical parents were, he paused. There's a slur. I won't use it. But the idea was that they were lesser. Unsuitable. That, Salazar said, is not what I believe. Then tell me what you do believe, Harry said. Because I'd rather understand the truth than repeat the version that survived. A long silence. The forest moved around them in small ways, birds and wind and the distant sound of someone at the camp starting the morning fire. Salazar's hands, Harry noticed, were very still on his knees. Everything about him was very still, but the stillness cost something. It was the stillness of a person holding a complex internal structure in order. I believe, Salazar said carefully, that we are building something exposed. Undefended in ways that Godric's sword cannot address. He paused. The magical world in this time is not accepted. We live in the seams. The margins. There are those in the non-magical world who fear us, who hunt us, who have burned people I knew. He said this last flatly, no invitation to sympathy, just fact laid down. Godric believes the answer is strength. Rowena believes the answer is intelligence. Helga believes the answer is community. His jaw worked. I believe the answer is caution. That bringing children to this place, children from non-magical families, children whose parents do not know what their children are and will not understand what they're becoming, creates exposure. Creates a path. A chain from our doors to the people who wish us dead. Harry was quiet for a moment. That's genuinely not what gets passed down, he said. No, Salazar said. Because caution is a harder argument to make than pride, and it loses to sentiment, and when you lose an argument you made from caution it becomes transmuted into cowardice. Into bigotry. He looked at the forest. I know I am losing. I have known it for some time. Helga will not be moved. Godric thinks my fears are political weakness. Rowena understands my reasoning and disagrees with my conclusions. A pause. I do not think some children are lesser. I think some children are less safe. There is a difference that no one will grant me. Harry thought about Hermione. About every Muggleborn witch and wizard he'd known, had fought beside, had loved. About the Muggleborn Registration Commission and the way that particular road ended. About the fact that Salazar's reasoning, however earnest here in this morning forest, was the same reasoning that had been twisted and sharpened into something that had killed people he loved. I hear you, Harry said. And I'm not going to pretend I agree, because I don't. But I hear what you're actually saying, which isn't what history said you said. He paused. The problem is, and I'm saying this because you asked me to be honest, the problem is that the argument you're making is one that can be taken by smaller people and made into something monstrous. You might build it from caution. Someone else builds the same wall from hate. And the wall is the same wall. Salazar looked at him. You can't control what people do with your ideas after you're gone, Harry said. But you can control whether you build the wall at all. The silence that followed was very long and very inhabited. A hawk crossed the sky above the forest, high and unhurried. You're telling me, Salazar said, that the thing I build from fear becomes the architecture of a hatred I never intended. Yes, Harry said. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Another long silence. Then, very quietly, does it succeed? The hatred? In your time, did it win? It almost won, Harry said. We stopped it. But the cost was, he looked at his hands. The cost was everything we had, and some of what we didn't have, and people who should still be alive. Salazar closed his eyes for a moment. One moment. Then he opened them and his face was composed again, the architecture of his expression rebuilt with the speed of long practice. You stopped it, he said. You personally. With a great deal of help, Harry said. None of it was done alone. But you were central. The prophecy said so, Harry said, with a dryness that came out before he could stop it. I try not to think about it too much. Salazar looked at him with something that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of dark amusement. A prophecy, he said. About you specifically. Since birth. And how did that feel? Mostly terrible, Harry said frankly. Sometimes clarifying. Ultimately, I think prophecies are less fixed than people believe. I think the universe offers shapes and people decide whether to step into them. He paused. I stepped into it because there was no one else. Not because the stars demanded it. Salazar studied him with those dark, measuring eyes. You are, he said, slowly, very different from what I expected when I heard someone had come through the time stones. What did you expect? A scholar. Rowena assumed a scholar also, which is why she's been disappointed by how little you care about theory. The faintest trace of something, not quite humor but adjacent to it, crossed his face. Or perhaps a politician. Someone sent intentionally with an agenda. I was studying an artifact alone at midnight, Harry said. That's the whole story. Why alone at midnight? Harry opened his mouth. Closed it. Because the honest answer was, because the days were too loud and full of people who looked at me like I was something that had survived when perhaps it shouldn't have, and alone at midnight was the only time I felt like myself. He settled on, I sleep badly. Salazar looked at him with the particular understanding of someone who recognized an incomplete truth but chose not to press it. The deep tongue, he said, shifting. You said it stopped costing you something. What does that mean? What does it feel like now? Like any language, Harry said. Like English. It just moves. There's no friction anymore. Can you feel the difference between languages? In the magic? Harry thought about it. Yes. English feels organized. Like walking on a road. Parseltongue feels, he tried to find the right description. Like walking in water. Moving in something that has its own current. You don't direct it the same way. Salazar was very still. That's accurate, he said. I've never heard anyone else describe it that way. Maybe they didn't want to admit it moves differently. Maybe, Salazar said. Or maybe they were taught to feel the friction and they mistook the friction for the language itself. He looked at Harry steadily. I want to show you something. A working. It requires Parseltongue as the casting tongue, which means I can't share it with anyone here. Godric has tried to learn even a word of it and it comes out as sound without meaning. Rowena's approach is purely intellectual, she understands it as a system but cannot feel it. He paused. Helga is the only one who has any sensitivity to it and she, a brief pause. She is kind about it. Show me, Harry said. The working was unlike anything in Harry's spell vocabulary. Salazar led him deeper into the forest to a clearing Harry hadn't been in before, small and dark, canopy too thick for much light, the ground soft with years of fallen needles. At the center was a rock formation that had clearly been worked, not recently, the moss was decades old, but intentionally, stones arranged in a loose spiral that Harry recognized as related to the standing stones he'd arrived through, smaller and less powerful but the same fundamental structure. Ward anchor, Salazar said. Pre-existing. Whoever built this camp before us was using it. I've been studying the frequency of it. He stepped into the spiral and looked at Harry. The magic in the anchor is in Parseltongue. Written into the stone itself. Not carved, spoken into the stone, which is a technique almost entirely lost now. He put his hand flat on the center stone and looked at Harry. What do you feel? Harry stepped in and crouched. Put his hand beside Salazar's. And felt it, not what he'd felt at the castle foundation, that young active forward-pressing energy, this was older and different. More lateral than vertical, spreading outward from the stone in pulses that had a rhythm like breathing. And under the rhythm, something that was almost linguistic, almost meaningful, in the way music was almost meaningful. It's saying something, Harry said, startled. Salazar looked at him. You can hear it? Not words. But the shape of words. The intention of it. He pressed his palm flatter against the stone. It's permission, he said slowly. It's saying this ground is permitted for something. Designated. Yes. Salazar's voice had changed, not emotional, but alive in a way that his careful neutrality usually suppressed. The stone was spoken over 100 years ago. By someone who practiced the old tongue as a foundational language rather than a secondary one. The designation is for sanctuary. For learning. The word isn't exactly shelter but it's in that family. He paused. What is it in your time? Harry thought about it, tried to follow the feeling of the word in the stone, the intention beneath the designation. Home, he said. The closest word is home. Salazar took his hand off the stone and stood and said nothing for a moment. His back was to Harry, which felt intentional, a moment of composure being rebuilt after something had gotten through the walls. Yes, he said finally. That's the word. Home. He turned back, composed. The working I want to show you uses this anchor. It requires both speakers, one to maintain the existing designation, one to add to it. He met Harry's eyes. I've been trying to add a protection ward for 3 weeks. The stone won't accept it from one speaker alone. It needs a harmonizing voice. Because the stone was built for 2? Harry said. Salazar blinked. Then, the most unguarded expression Harry had seen from him, he looked genuinely surprised. Yes, he said slowly. I believe so. I assumed it was a power requirement. But, he looked at the stone. 2 speakers. 2 intentions aligned. He looked back at Harry. Did you work that out just now? The stone is lonely, Harry said, which sounded absurd the moment he said it but felt completely accurate. Salazar stared at him. Then he made a sound that was definitively a laugh, short and genuine and clearly unexpected even to himself, and it transformed his face the way sun transformed a winter landscape, suddenly, briefly, with full commitment. The stone is lonely, he repeated. I've spent 3 weeks with resonance theory and frequency analysis and the stone is lonely. I've always been better at the feeling of things than the theory, Harry said. Helga, Salazar said, with something that was warmth despite every effort to contain it, is going to be insufferable when I tell her you said that. They worked the stone for 2 hours and it was extraordinary. Not visually, the ward that built over the clearing was nearly invisible, a subtle shift in the quality of light and air, the kind of ward that didn't announce itself. But in the building of it, in the back and forth of it, the counterpoint of 2 parcel-tongue voices weaving around each other, one maintaining the foundation designation, one building the protection over it, Harry felt magic operating at a level that he'd never consciously accessed before. Not the weaponized magic of combat. Not even the deep foundational magic Helga had been showing him. Something between and beyond both, relational magic. Magic that required 2 people to understand each other in order to work. And they did, Harry realized as they settled into the working's rhythm. He and Salazar understood each other in the language, which meant on some level they understood each other underneath it. When the ward clicked into place, a gentle, decisive sensation, like a bolt sliding home, they both felt it simultaneously and both stood in a cleared space for a moment in the specific silence that follows something done correctly. That, Harry said, was remarkable. Yes. Salazar looked at the air above the stone with something close to satisfaction. The Founders Protection Network has a gap that's concerned me since we arrived. That gap is now, he paused. Less gapped. Eloquent. I'm a practitioner, not a poet. He glanced at Harry. Though I notice you have some instinct for language. The interpretation of the stone's designation. Where did that come from? Helga's lessons, Harry said. Feeling rather than naming. I've been at it 2 days and I'm already terrible at half of it. "You're not terrible," Salazar said, which was clearly the highest praise he offered, and he seemed aware that he'd offered it because he added, immediately, "You're inconsistent. You access the deeper feeling in flashes rather than as a sustained state. That's a function of habit, not capacity. You sound like Helga." "Helga and I agree on more than either of us finds comfortable," Salazar said, with a dryness that made Harry smile. They walked back toward camp, and as they cleared the tree-line, Harry saw Godric at the training ground drilling 3 young students in basic combat movement, his big voice carrying across the open air with the natural volume of a man who had never needed to repeat himself. He looked up when Harry and Salazar emerged from the forest together, and something crossed his face, brief, complicated, before he went back to the drill. Salazar noticed. He always noticed things. "He worries," he said, without heat. "When I spend time with someone new, he worries about what he paused. "What I'm constructing." "Are you constructing anything?" "I'm always constructing something." He looked at Harry. "As are you. The difference is that yours is visible. You're open in a way I find unusual. You say what you mean. You don't hedge." He paused. "It makes people trust you quickly. Does that ever concern you?" "Sometimes," Harry said. "In my experience, people tend to trust me right up until they decide everything that went wrong is my fault. And then? Then I deal with that too," Harry said simply. Salazar looked at him for a moment. "Aldrich will come again," he said, shifting. "What happened last night at the ward, that wasn't a visit. It was a survey." He paused. "I've dealt with his kind before. Old tradition practitioners who feel threatened by structure. They don't argue. They don't negotiate. They wait until they understand exactly what you have, and then they take it apart." "He seemed willing to talk last night," Harry said. "He talked to see who was worth talking to and to measure what he's facing," Salazar said. "The conversation was information gathering. He now knows the new one from the future can be reasoned with, which is valuable to a man who wants someone on the inside." He glanced at Harry sideways. "Be careful about how much honesty you offer him. You think he'll approach me separately? I think he already has. The temporal comment at the ward, he was telling you he'd identified you. Making himself known to you specifically." A pause. "He's not stupid. He'll approach the person who seems most independent of the Founders' established positions." He looked at Harry steadily. "Which is you?" "I'm not independent," Harry said. "I have a position." "What position?" "The school gets built," Harry said. "That's not negotiable for me. Not because of Hogwarts, though yes, obviously. But because what they're doing here is right. The argument for it is sound and the result of it is real, and I won't be neutral about it." Salazar was quiet for a moment. "Even knowing how it ends? Between us?" "I don't know how it ends," Harry said. "I know one version. The version that survived 1,000 years of retelling." Something shifted in Salazar's face, not much, but enough. He looked at Harry with an expression that was, for the first time since they'd met, something close to unguarded. "What would you change," he said, "if you could? In the version you know?" "I'd have you stay," Harry said simply. The political structure of the Founders was visible as a weather system was visible. You couldn't see the pressure, but you could see everything bending under it. Harry spent the afternoon on the castle's second level, helping with construction alongside the workers in the basic practical way that felt more natural than standing around observing, moving material, holding alignment charms while others set stone, the physical collective work of building something. Helga had looked at him doing this the first time and given a nod that meant more than it appeared to. From up here he could see the camp, the forest, the 4 Founders moving through their days, and he started to understand the dynamic the way you understood a piece of music once you could hear all the instruments separately. Godric and Helga were the heart of it, not romantically, though there was a warmth between them that ran deep and old, but structurally. They were the ones who had made the first decision together, drawn the first plans, planted the first foundation stone. They argued constantly and agreed on everything that mattered, and their arguments were the productive kind that sharpened both of them. When the construction hit a problem, they were the ones who put their heads together first. Rowena was slightly apart, not isolated, but elevated in her own architecture, moving between problems and conversations as a solver rather than a participant. She cared about the project with a ferocity that she expressed through perfecting it rather than embracing it, and Harry had started to understand that this was her version of love, the relentless improvement of things she valued. She and Godric clashed on principle and respected each other completely and were both too proud to admit either. And Salazar was the fourth corner, and the fourth corner was showing the first cracks. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet in the way fractures in stone were quiet, invisible until the weight applied was more than the structure could bear. Harry saw it in the way conversations sometimes shifted when Salazar entered them, in the careful calibrations everyone made, in the particular courtesy of people trying to hold something together by handling it gently. Salazar himself moved through the camp with his characteristic stillness and contributed more to the actual building than almost anyone except Helga. His understanding of foundational magic and ward structures was extraordinary, his architectural instincts precise and innovative, and he worked with a concentrated dedication that suggested someone who poured the things he couldn't say into the things he could build. Harry watched him work and thought, this is a man who loves this project and already believes he's going to lose it. That evening, with the towers catching the last of the day's light, Rowena found Harry on the castle's upper scaffolding where he'd taken to sitting after dinner, watching the sun go down over the forest. She brought her parchment and her circlet and nothing else, and she sat beside him on the plank and looked at the forest for a moment before she said, "The time turner. What about it?" "I've been thinking about the resonance theory. The idea that it goes where the user's magic calls it." She paused. "I ran calculations this morning. The temporal displacement from your era to ours is extraordinary. The energy required to span that distance shouldn't be available in a single device regardless of its design." She paused. "Unless the destination was already anchored." Harry looked at her. "Something here," she said carefully, "was pulling from your end as well as pushing from your end. A resonance at both termini. For that to work, the destination would need to have a signature. A magical frequency that was already familiar to you." She looked at him. "Something you had an existing deep connection to." Harry was quiet. "The foundation stones," Rowena said. "I've been mapping their frequency. It matches the resonance signature of the time turner's amber sand." She looked at him steadily. "The stones of this school called you here. Or rather, you called them, from 1,000 years away, because they're the thing you have the deepest connection to." Harry looked out at the forest, at the dark wall of ancient trees, at the sky going rose and gold above them. He thought about being 11 years old and crossing a lake in a boat toward lit windows in a tower, and the specific feeling of that, the recognition, impossible for a child who'd never been there, of somewhere that was his. "I know," he said quietly. Rowena looked at him. "You knew." "Not consciously. But when the time turner grabbed me, there was a direction. There was somewhere it was heading. I felt it but I didn't understand it until now." He paused. "It makes sense. I spent 7 years in that castle. 7 years in what will be those walls." He gestured at the half-built towers below them. "Of course there's a resonance. That's not an entirely rational explanation. Magic," Harry said, "rarely is." Rowena made a small sound that was approximately agreement with reluctance. "The other thing," she said, and her voice shifted, still precise, but something under the precision that was less controlled. "I want to ask you about the Patronus. You've been thinking about it since I showed you." "Since before that, actually. Since you arrived and I registered the nature of your magic. The Patronus is a fully externalized soul fragment. A piece of self given physical form by the most concentrated positive memory available. It's not a protection spell. It's a—" she stopped. "Tried again. It's an argument. Against darkness. A specific, personal, irreducible argument. I'd never thought of it that way, Harry said honestly. I have, she said. Since last night I've been thinking about what it means that a spell like that was developed. What problem it was solving. Because the Dementors it repels, those exist now, in my time. We know them. We avoid them. We have no counter for them. She paused. The man who invented the Patronus charm, he solved something we haven't solved yet. Or she, Harry said. Or she, Rowena agreed. And I want to solve it. She looked at the forest. Can you tell me, without telling me anything about the future, can you tell me what the theoretical basis of the charm is? Not who developed it. Not when. Just the mechanics. The mechanics, Harry said, are approximately what you already said. Memory as active agent, not passive fuel. The magic doesn't consume the memory, it expresses it. The shape of the animal is the shape of the self at its most honest. He paused. And the reason it works against Dementors specifically is because Dementors feed on despair. They can't consume a thing that has decided to be joyful. Joy isn't an absence of darkness. It's a separate substance. Rowena was very still. Did that help? Harry said. Considerably, she said, in a voice that was working very hard at being academic and not quite succeeding. Yes. That, she looked at her parchment. Harry. Yes. I want to tell you something that isn't a question or a theory. She said it like she was announcing she was going to do something mildly dangerous. You've been here 3 days. In 3 days you've done several things. You fought Godric to a draw and gave him the most useful tactical feedback he's had in years. You sat with Salazar in the forest and said things to him that I've been trying to find words for since the disagreements began. You spoke to Aldrich at the ward and he left without incident, which hasn't happened before. She paused. And what you showed me last night with the Patronus was, she stopped. Tried again. I would very much like to know if you're doing this deliberately. Doing what? Fixing us. Harry looked at her. I'm not fixing you. You don't need fixing. Individually, no. Collectively, she looked at the camp below, the fires coming on in the early dark, Godric's big laugh carrying across the open space, the warm smell of Helga's cooking. Collectively we are moving towards something that history has apparently confirmed ends badly. I know, Harry said. And you intend to, I intend to be here, Harry said. That's all. I'm not running a strategy. I'm just, he paused. I've spent my whole life being told what the story is supposed to be. What the ending is supposed to look like. And every time I've decided that the version of events where the good thing doesn't happen is unacceptable. He looked at her. The version where you four break apart and the school carries that fracture for 1,000 years, that's unacceptable. So I'm here. Just being here, Rowena said, with a precision that made the words mean something different than they'd meant when he'd said them. Just being here. She looked at him for a long moment in the failing light, and the thing that happened in her expression was something Harry had learned in 3 days to look for, the lowering of that carefully maintained analytical distance, the moment when Rowena Ravenclaw stopped cataloging something and started simply experiencing more actions. Request aborted. Write the next chapter now, the Founding Magic Chapter 4. Architecture of the Mind. The ward broke at midnight. Not catastrophically, not the explosive failure of something overwhelmed by force, but the quiet, surgical failure of something that had been unpicked. Harry felt it the moment it happened, the monitoring charm he'd set at the treeline pulsing twice against his wrist like a heartbeat interrupted, and he was out of his bedroll and through the tent flap in the same motion, wand in hand, bare feet on cold grass. The camp was quiet. No alarm, no shouting, no visible disturbance. 2 workers on the night shift were moving between the construction levels with lanterns, unhurried and oblivious. The fire had burned down to coals. The half-built towers stood dark against a sky full of stars. But the western ward was wrong. He moved toward it without running. Running attracted attention and he didn't know yet whether attention was the right response. The ward's edge was a sensation rather than a visible thing, a slight change in air pressure and magical density, and as he approached the western boundary he found a gap, a section roughly 6 feet across where the ward had been, not blasted, not overwhelmed, folded. Turned back on itself in a technique so precise it left no trace of force. This was done by someone who understood ward architecture at a foundational level. He crouched and studied it. The folding had been done from the outside. It would reopen in approximately. He pressed his palm flat against the invisible boundary and felt the half-life of the working, 4 hours. Long enough for something to come in and leave before the ward reknit. But nothing had come in yet, as far as he could feel. The gap was fresh. Preparation, he thought. He stayed crouched for another minute, thinking it through. Godric had been here 3 nights ago measuring the camp. He'd identified the western ward as Helga's primary construction, the most sophisticated section, the hardest to crack conventionally. Instead of cracking it he'd studied it and found the seam. That was a level of patience and technical precision that hadn't been fully visible in the direct confrontation at the boundary. Harry reset the gap with a layered ward of his own, not replacing Helga's construction, which he didn't fully understand and didn't want to corrupt, but bridging the fold with something simpler and sturdier, the kind of ward he'd learned to throw up fast in the field, designed less for elegance than for the specific property of being very difficult to fold or unpick because it didn't have the sophisticated layered architecture that provided the leverage for that technique. Sometimes basic and solid beat complex and beautiful. Then he went to wake Salazar. He didn't wake the others yet. He went to Salazar first because Salazar had told him this was coming and because Salazar's understanding of ward structures was the most technically precise of the 4, and because Harry had made a decision somewhere in the last 3 days that if the version of events he was trying to prevent required trust, then trust had to be built deliberately and specifically, not spread thin across every available surface. Salazar was awake when Harry knocked. Of course he was. He came to the tent flap already dressed, already holding his wand, and looked at Harry's face and said simply, "Western ward. Folded, not broken. 4-hour gap. I've bridged it." Harry paused. "He's coming tonight." Salazar stepped out of the tent and looked toward the western tree line without any visible urgency, which was its own kind of urgency. The gap was prepared in advance. Done carefully. He understands Helga's architecture well enough to find the seam in it. "He's been studying us longer than 3 days, Salazar said. "Probably since we broke ground." He looked at Harry. "You said he'd approach you separately." "You said that." "I said he would." "Has he?" "Not yet." Harry paused. "But I've been thinking about what that approach looks like when it comes. He's not going to try to recruit me with flattery. He's too precise for that. He's going to offer me something true." Salazar looked at him. "What true thing can he offer you?" "A way home," Harry said. The words sat in the night air between them. "The time stones," Salazar said slowly. "He knows the temporal markers. He identified my displacement the moment he saw me." Harry looked at the tree line. If he understands the stones well enough to predict their cycling, he might understand them well enough to accelerate the cycle. And that's leverage. He paused. "Which means when he comes to me with it I have to be careful about how I respond." "You won't take it," Salazar said. "Not a question." "I'm not going anywhere," Harry said. "Not yet. But I need him to believe I might be persuaded, because a man who thinks you're reachable keeps talking, and a talking man tells you things." Salazar looked at him for a long moment in the dark. "You've done this before," he said. "Surveillance, misdirection, pressure management." Harry said. "Yeah. A few times. In the war you mentioned." "In the war I mentioned." "How old were you?" "In the war." 17 when it ended." Another silence, different from the previous ones. Something in Salazar's careful expression moved. "We should tell the others," Harry said. "Yes. Helga first, it's her ward, she needs to know the architecture was compromised. Then Godric." He paused. "Rowena is already awake. She's been in the library tent since the second hour of the night." "How do you know that?" "She's always in the library tent since the second hour of the night," Salazar said, with the certainty of long observation, and they went to wake Helga. Helga's response to being told her ward had been folded was to look at the western boundary for approximately 4 seconds and then say, "Right," in a voice that meant several layered things, the outermost layer being practical acknowledgement and the layers underneath being something considerably warmer and more dangerous. She put her hands on the gap Harry had bridged and studied it for a moment. "Good patch," she said. "You used field construction. It's what I know fastest. And it's not what he'll know how to fold, because he learned against traditional layering." She pressed her palms flat. "I'm going to reinforce from the inside. Different technique, instead of layering I'm going to grow the ward into the ground itself, anchor it the same way I anchored the foundation stones. He can fold anything that floats above the earth. He can't fold something that is the earth." She looked at Harry and Salazar. "Give me 20 minutes. She went to work without ceremony or spectacle, crouching at the ward boundary in the dark in her nightclothes with both palms in the grass, and what she did was quiet and enormous. Harry, standing back to give her room, could feel the ground responding to her the same way it had responded during the morning exercises but amplified, the earth itself becoming the ward structure, patient and immovable. He thought, Godric is not wrong that she understands foundational magic better than almost anyone alive. And then, that is exactly why he's wrong about everything else. They gathered in the fire circle with the coals rebuilt to a proper blaze, all 5 of them. Rowena had appeared from the library tent when she'd felt the ward activity, parchment still in hand, ink on her fingers, and Harry laid out what he'd found and what he'd deduced and what he believed Godric intended. "Tonight," Godric said. The word was simple and committed. "Tonight was preparation," Harry said. "The gap was created to be used, not used immediately. He'll want the ward folded but he'll come when he's ready, not because the opening is available. He's patient. Then we have time to prepare." "We have some time," Harry said. "But preparation has to be careful. If he scouts the camp before he comes in and sees that we're positioned for a fight he'll delay again and fold a different section." He looked at Godric. "He can't see us ready. The camp has to look normal." Godric looked like he wanted to argue with this on principle and managed not to. He looked instead at Salazar. "You've dealt with his kind before. What does he want? Not the argument he makes, what does he want?" Salazar considered the fire. "He wants the school not to exist," he said. "But underneath that, underneath the ideology, he wants to matter. He's old tradition in a world that is visibly moving past the old tradition. What we're building here is not just a school. It is a statement that his way is no longer sufficient. That is not a political threat. That is an existential one." He paused. "He'll try to damage the foundation work. Not destroy the building, destroy the magic beneath it. The bedrock bonding. If he can destabilize that he doesn't need to touch the walls." The silence that followed had weight. "The foundation stones," Helga said. "The bedrock anchor. The same technique he was studying tonight," Salazar said. "Your layered ward and the foundation bonding used the same fundamental architecture. He was learning it." Harry looked at Salazar. "The spiral clearing," he said. "The ward anchor we work together. It's part of the foundation network," Salazar confirmed. "If that anchor falls the whole network destabilizes." He met Harry's eyes. "It's also the most vulnerable point, now that Helga's reinforced the western ward. He'll know, if he's been watching us, that we've been working in that clearing. He may not know exactly what we built there. So the spiral clearing is where he goes," Harry said. "And we need someone there who he won't expect. Everyone looked at Harry. Me, Harry said. You, Godric confirmed. I'm the unknown variable, Harry said. He's assessed all four of you. He has a model of how you respond. He doesn't have one for me yet, which means when he arrives at the clearing and finds me there instead of an empty anchor stone, he'll have to improvise. He paused. And Aldrich doesn't seem like someone who improvises comfortably. He'll try the honest approach, Salazar said. As I said. The offer of a way home. Let him. Harry looked around the fire circle. Where does everyone else need to be? Rowena pulled him aside before they dispersed to prepare. She didn't say anything at first, just walked with him toward the eastern tower and stopped there where the half-built wall blocked the firelight and made the dark more private. The time turner, she said. I finished the calculations tonight. All of them. Harry waited. The crack in the glass is not damage, she said. It was the device completing its function. It brought you here and it, finished. Like a seed that becomes a plant. The mechanism is expended. She looked at him steadily. But the chain is still live. The resonance is still active. The amber sand, she paused. The sand doesn't need the glass anymore because the glass was just the container for the sand, and the sand's destination was never the past. The sand's destination was, the foundation, Harry said. She looked at him. Helga showed me this morning, he said. When I do the grounding work, when I push down through the floor and find the deep earth, the chain gets warm. I feel the anchor stones. I feel the school. He held up his wrist, the chain gleaming faintly. I don't think it brought me here to visit. I think it brought me here because there's something I'm supposed to, he stopped. Do, Rowena said. Or leave behind. Yes. She looked at the chain for a long moment. If you perform a sufficiently deep foundational working, she said carefully, while the resonance is active, while the chain is live, you could anchor something permanently into the structure of the school. Something that would persist for 1,000 years. What kind of something? I don't know. That depends on what you, she stopped. Tried again. That depends on what you are, at the core of it. What the deepest expression of your magic is. She met his eyes. What's the deepest thing you have? Harry thought about it honestly, which meant he thought about the moments where he'd felt his magic most completely, not the most powerful spells, not the most complex workings, but the moments where it had been most him. The Patronus at 13, buying his friends time to change history. The shield he'd thrown over Neville when everything was falling apart. The moment in the forest when he'd walked toward death with his whole self and the choice had felt completely free. Protection, he said. Specifically, protection of people who can't protect themselves yet. Students. He looked at the half-built walls. That's what I have. Rowena was quiet for a long moment. The tower stones hummed faintly with the foundational magic Helga had grown into them. When this is over, she said. When Aldrich is dealt with and the immediate crisis is past, I want to attempt the working with you. Together. She paused. The resonance anchor will need a theoretical framework to hold the intention stable enough to root it into the stones permanently. I can provide the framework. You provide the actual magic, Harry said. The actual magic, she confirmed. Yes. He looked at her in the dark beside the tower and thought about what it meant that Rowena Ravenclaw was asking him to build something with her, asking with the particular vulnerability of someone for whom asking was structurally difficult, for whom the admission that she needed a collaborator rather than just resources was its own kind of confession. Yes, he said. Absolutely yes. She nodded, once, with a composure that was slightly more deliberate than usual, and turned to go back toward the library tent where she would, Harry knew, spend the remaining hours before dawn turning this into a framework that could hold the weight of 1,000 years. He stood by the tower and felt the chain warm against his wrist and thought, so that's why. The weight was the worst part. He'd always found waiting worse than the thing itself, the specific suspended quality of time between knowing what was coming and its arrival, every minute too long and also somehow too short. He sat in Salazar's spiral clearing with his back against the center stone and his wand in his lap and used the time to practice what Helga had been teaching him, the grounding work, the listening. The forest at night had a different quality than by day, denser, more inhabited, the ambient magic thicker and less directional, moving in slow tidal patterns rather than the purposeful flows of daylight. He felt Godric the moment he entered the forest. Not the ward, Helga's reinforced ward was in the ground now, deep and patient, and it didn't sing when it was crossed so much as notice. But the old sorcerer's magic had a signature like a stone dropped in still water, deep, spreading, displacing everything around it in concentric rings of pressure. Harry felt it and sat still and waited and let it come. Godric entered the clearing 10 minutes later. He moved through the trees without light or sound, wearing the same rough clothes, carrying the same staff, and he stopped at the clearing's edge when he saw Harry sitting at the center stone. His gray eyes adjusted to the dark quickly. He wasn't surprised, exactly, a man who survived long enough to become what Godric was had learned not to be surprised, but something recalibrated behind his eyes. "Expected an empty clearing," he said. "I know," Harry said. "Sit down." A pause. Then, unhurried, Godric walked to the far side of the clearing and settled himself on a fallen log with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in forests at midnight. He planted the staff in the ground beside him and looked at Harry. "The founder who isn't a founder," he said. "That's accurate. The one from the future who fell into their project by accident and has spent 4 days becoming essential to it." He studied Harry with those gray eyes. "You're either very lucky or very inevitable. I haven't decided which." "Neither have I," Harry said. Godric almost smiled. Not warmly, more like recognition, one honest answer meeting another. "The ward," he said. Helga reinforced it. "The fold won't hold." He nodded, unsurprised. "She's remarkable. I've been watching her work for 6 weeks. I've never seen anyone marry earth magic and ward architecture that completely." He paused. "It's a waste." "So you've said." "I mean it genuinely. Not as criticism, as grief." He looked at the trees. "She could have been the greatest foundational practitioner of this age or any age. Instead she's going to spend her life teaching children and reinforcing walls." "Teaching children and reinforcing walls," Harry said, "is how you change the world." Godric looked at him. "You believe that?" "I grew up in what she built. I know it." "And is the world changed?" Harry thought about the war. About Hermione Granger, Muggle-born and extraordinary, who had saved his life more times than he could count with knowledge learned in a castle built by 4 people in a clearing in a forest 1,000 years before she was born. About Neville Longbottom, who had been told he was talentless until someone believed in him and had ended up killing a Horcrux with his bare hands and a Gryffindor's sword. About every person who had come through those doors uncertain and left certain. "Yes," he said. "The world is changed." Godric was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of a man genuinely listening, which was both unexpected and clarifying. This wasn't performance. He was actually here to understand something. "You know," he said, "why I don't just leave it. Why I don't accept the school as a fact and move on." "Because you love magic," Harry said. "The same reason they're building it." Something moved in Godric's face. "You love magic the way it was," Harry continued. "Wild and unstructured and infinite. You love the version of it that existed before schools and categories and textbooks and approved wand movements. You see them building walls around the thing you love and it feels like loss." He paused. "You're not wrong that something is lost. You're wrong about what to do with the loss." Godric looked at him for a long time. "And what does one do with the loss?" "You mourn it and you let the new thing be what it is," Harry said. "The wild magic doesn't disappear when you name it. It goes underground. It lives in the seams. I've felt it here, For days ago I had no idea how to feel the deep earth, how to hear the magic underneath the spells, and now I can, because Helga showed me, in a school setting, in a structured lesson, how to find the thing that was always there. He met Aldric's eyes. You're afraid that naming it kills it. But naming it is how you give it to people who wouldn't otherwise find it alone. A long silence. You're very young, Aldric said. I've been told. And you have the confidence of someone who has already survived the worst thing that was going to happen to him. More or less, Harry said. Aldric looked at the center stone. I came here to destabilize the anchor. You know that. Yes. You're sitting on it. Yes. Aldric looked at him. You're not going to let me. I'm not going to let you, Harry confirmed. But I want to be clear, I'm not going to attack you unless you force it. I have no interest in fighting you. I'd rather you left. He paused. And then thought about what I said. And maybe came back. Through the front entrance, in daylight, to a conversation with all four of them. Because you have things worth saying and the way you're saying them is wasting everyone's time including yours. Aldric stared at him. You're not going to win this through sabotage, Harry said. They're too good. Between the four of them they've already closed every hole you found. If you destroy the anchor I'll rebuild it, it's anchored to my magic now as well as Salazar's. If you break Helga's ward she'll just grow a better one. Rowena will identify every weak point in the foundation before you can exploit it. And Godric will be standing in front of all of it with a sword and several grievances. He spread his hands. You're not going to win the tactical version of this fight. And the philosophical version? Aldric said. That you might win, Harry said honestly. Or you might lose. But it's worth having, because you're not wrong about everything, and they know that, and if you sat down with them like a person instead of circling like a threat you might actually change something. He paused. You won't stop the school. But you might shape what it teaches. Aldric looked at the clearing, at the trees, at the center stone with Harry sitting on it in the dark with perfect calm. He looked like a man doing something genuinely difficult, which was reconsidering a position he'd already committed significant resources to. He stood up. Picked up his staff. I underestimated you, he said. People tend to, Harry said, without heat. I'm young and I arrived accidentally. It's a reasonable assumption. The offer still stands, Aldric said. The time stones. I can accelerate the cycle. If you want to go home before the month is out. I know you can, Harry said. And I know you're offering it because you think I'm not fully committed to what they're building and might be moved by a way out. He looked at Aldric steadily. I don't want to go home yet. And when I do, it'll be when the stones cycle naturally. Why? Because I'm not done, Harry said simply. Aldric nodded once. And walked back into the forest. And the clearing was quiet and the anchor stone was warm against Harry's spine and the ward at the camp's edge held, solid as the earth it had been grown into. Harry sat still for another few minutes, letting the silence settle, and then he felt, in sequence, Helga's ward acknowledged that something had left its radius, Salazar's presence at the tree leaned shift from positioned and ready to relaxed, and Godric's very distinctive magical signature moving away from the northern approach toward camp, which meant the perimeter they'd set had stood down. He exhaled. Good enough. Morning came with the news that 3 more families had arrived overnight, 2 from the north with children of 8 and 10, 1 from the Welsh coast with twins who had apparently been making spontaneous combustion events happen to the furniture for 2 years. The camp's energy shifted upward with their arrival, a kind of forward momentum that was visible in how the workers moved and how the 4 founders responded. Helga was in her element, meeting the families with the particular warmth that made people feel like the frightening thing was actually fine, organizing lodging, getting the children settled, producing food from somewhere with the unconscious ease of someone who had never once in her life failed to have enough. Godric picked up the older child, a solemn 8-year-old boy who had not spoken since arriving, and showed him the construction, carrying him on his shoulders and explaining what each part of the building would become with the narrative enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed this was the best possible use of time. By the end of the tour the boy was talking. Rowena took the twins aside and gave them a problem to solve, purely theoretical, no magic involved, a geometric puzzle she'd apparently been carrying in her pocket against exactly this kind of occasion. She watched them work and made precise, quiet suggestions, and when the smaller twin got it and looked up with that specific expression of someone who had just understood something they hadn't understood before, Rowena's face did the thing it did, the composure temporarily unnecessary, something genuine showing through. Salazar watched from the edge of the activity. He watched the children most specifically, with an expression that Harry had learned to read now, not coldness, but the careful management of something that wasn't cold at all, something that needed the distance to stay functional. Harry came to stand beside him. "He'll be back," Salazar said, without preamble. "Aldrich?" "Yes." "Differently." Harry paused. "I think he might actually come through the front this time." Salazar made a sound that wasn't quite skepticism. "What did you say to him?" "The truth," Harry said. "Approximately." "Which truth?" "That he loves the thing he's trying to destroy." Harry watched the children. "That love expressed as destruction is a waste." A long pause. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" Salazar said. "Expressing love as destruction." "No," Harry said. "I think you're expressing love as fear." "Which is different." He paused. "You're afraid of what happens to this thing when it encounters the world outside it. So you want to control the parameters before the encounter." He looked at Salazar. "But the world is the thing you're preparing people for. You can't armor them against it by excluding it." Salazar was quiet. "The children," Harry said. "Not abstractly, those specific children. The 8-year-old who just started talking because Godric carried him somewhere extraordinary. The twins who just understood that their minds work quickly and that's a good thing, not a terrifying thing." He paused. "Where were they born? Do you know?" Salazar looked at them. "No. Does it matter?" A very long pause. The longer pauses with Salazar were where the real work happened. He didn't perform thinking, he actually did it, which meant you had to let him. "No," he said finally. Very quietly. "It doesn't matter." "Then say that," Harry said. "Not to me. To them." Salazar looked at him, and the dark eyes were complicated with about 17 things at once, and Harry held the look without pressure, without hurry, and eventually Salazar looked away, back at the children, and his hands uncrossed from his arms and hung at his sides, which was for Salazar approximately the equivalent of anyone else opening a door. They did the working that afternoon. Rowena had been up since before dawn building the theoretical framework, and she laid it out for Harry at the long table in the library tent with the precision of someone who had converted an enormous intuition into an exact structure overnight. The parchment was covered in diagrams that were part mathematical, part magical notation, part something that was neither and both, the particular visual language of a mind that thought in systems. "The resonance chain," she said, touching the drawing of the time-turner's fused chain, "acts as the conduit between your magical signature and the Foundation network. But the conduit is one-directional at rest, it resonates with the stones but doesn't transfer anything. To make a permanent anchoring you need to reverse the directionality. Instead of the stones pulling your resonance to bring you here, your resonance pushes into the stones." She looked at him. "The framework I've built around the intention will hold the shape of it stable during the transfer. Without the framework the intention would diffuse into the Foundation network generally, which would have some effect but not a specific or lasting one. With the framework it goes in as a discrete structure," Harry said. "Exactly. A specific magical intention, anchored to the specific frequency of your signature, held in the deep foundation permanently." She paused. "Do you know what you want to anchor?" "Yes," Harry said. "Tell me." "I need to build the containing structure around the specific intention." Harry thought about how to say it. I want the school to know when someone inside it needs help, he said. Not in a surveillance way. Not monitoring. But the way a good teacher knows when a student is struggling before the student can ask. The way a home knows its people. He paused. I want the magic of the place to be responsive. To need. To be on the side of anyone inside it who is in genuine danger. He looked at Rowena. I want it to have a will toward protection. Built in. Not a spell that can be removed. A property. Rowena looked at him for a long moment. The room of requirement, she said softly. Harry went still. You mentioned a room, she said carefully. When you told me not to tell you the origin of the pensive concept. You said there was a room in the school that provided what was needed. She met his eyes. You weren't describing a room. You were describing a property of the building itself. Rowena, you're not creating the room of requirement, she said. You're creating the impulse that eventually becomes it. The will toward provision that manifests, over 1,000 years of magical development, in a specific room that provides specific things. She looked at her framework. This isn't accidental. This is the reason the time turner brought you here. She looked up. This is what only you could give, because only someone who knew what the school became could intend it specifically enough to anchor it correctly. The library tent was very quiet. I know, Harry said. You knew before I told you. I figured it out last night, he said. When I was sitting on the anchor stone in the clearing, waiting for Godric. I had a lot of time to think. Rowena looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that moved her framework significantly, the expression of someone recalibrating at the deepest level. Are you all right with it, she said, and the question was unexpectedly personal coming from her, the first time she'd asked about his emotional state rather than his theoretical understanding. Harry thought about it honestly. A kid named Neville Longbottom found a room once, he said. When he desperately needed somewhere to practice. The room had everything he needed, perfectly arranged, and he used it to teach 30 other kids how to defend themselves when no one else would. He paused. If what I'm about to do is the thing that made that possible, he looked at her. Yeah. I'm all right with it. She nodded. Then let's begin. They took the foundation stone at the castle's center point, the original stone, the first one laid, deep in the bedrock of what would become the Great Hall. Helga had shown Harry where it was during the second morning's lesson, had put his hands on the ground and said feel there, that's the heartbeat, and it had been the first time he'd felt the school's pulse clearly. All 4 founders were present, which hadn't been planned but which felt correct the moment it happened, Godric standing to the north with his hand against the foundation wall, Helga crouching at the south with her palms in the earth, Salazar positioned at the east with the focused stillness of someone lending his full attention. Rowena stood beside Harry at the center stone and held the theoretical framework in her mind like a lantern, visible to Harry as a slight brightening in the ambient magic around her, the shape of her intention clarifying the space. Harry knelt on the ground and put both hands flat on the foundation stone. He felt the deep earth immediately, the school's heartbeat, young and strong and forward-pressing. He felt the time-turner chain warm against his wrist, the resonance alive between him and the stones, the frequency matching. He felt the 4 founders around him, their distinct magical signatures as different as 4 instruments in a room, all of them turned toward this. He thought about every student who would ever be afraid. Not abstractly. Specifically. The 11-year-old arriving on a boat across a dark lake, looking up at lit windows and feeling something enormous happen in their chest. The student sitting alone in a corridor crying for reasons they couldn't explain to anyone. The one who was being hurt and couldn't ask for help. The one who was brilliant and had no one to tell them so. The one who was going to be at the center of something terrible and needed the building itself to be on their side. He thought, I want you to know them. I want you to be for them. Not walls and rooms, a will. A will toward the students inside you. A will toward their safety and their need. The chain burned, not painfully but intensely, like the moment before a spell completes, the tipping point, and something moved from him into the stone, something that was entirely his and no spell he'd ever learned, something from the part of him that was most fundamentally Harry Potter, who had spent his whole life being protected by things that loved him before he understood what love meant. The stone rang. Not audibly, or not only audibly, something below sound, something in the bones. The Foundation network received the intention and took it down, spreading it through the bedrock in the same slow patient way Helga grew her wards through the earth, and the castle above them, young stone, still damp with new laying, seemed to settle in a new way, a way that was different from the settling of weight and time. It was settled the way a living thing settles when it recognizes someone. The chain at Harry's wrist cooled. The amber sand in the cracked glass, still for 4 days, shifted once, in a slow spiral, and stopped. Harry let out a breath and sat back on his heels. Rowena's hand landed on his shoulder, briefly, the most physical contact she'd offered in the 4 days he'd known her, which made it mean more than it might have otherwise. Then it was gone and she was standing back and making a small precise sound of someone whose theory had been confirmed in practice. Helga, from the south, was crying in the uncomplicated way of someone for whom genuine emotion didn't require justification. She wasn't trying to stop it or manage it, just letting it happen, which was very Helga. Godric had his hand on the Foundation wall and was looking at it with an expression Harry had never seen on his face, not pride exactly, because Godric's pride was loud and this was quiet. Something more like reverence. Something that required the loud parts of him to go still. Salazar looked at Harry from across the center stone. His expression was composed, as always, but his eyes were doing the thing they did when something had gotten through the walls, that barely perceptible aliveness, the thing that surfaced when the containment wasn't quite enough. He didn't say anything. He gave a single nod. Harry nodded back. Outside, beyond the construction, somewhere in the ancient forest that had stood here before any of them were born and would stand here long after, something, a bird, a wind, a motion of the world acknowledging a change, moved through the canopy in a wave that came toward the half-built castle and passed over it and continued south, and the morning after felt the same as the morning before except in a specific way that it didn't. The school had a new property now. And no one except the 5 people in the Foundation stones would ever know exactly where it had come from, or when, or why, only that it was there, deep in the bedrock, permanent and patient, on the side of every frightened student who would ever need it. Harry stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees and looked at the walls going up around him and felt the time-turner chain cool and quiet against his wrist, its purpose completed, its urgency gone. One thing left, he thought. Aldrich. Chapter 5, What We Leave Behind. Aldrich came back on the 7th day. Through the front entrance. Harry was on the eastern scaffolding when he saw him, the big frame emerging from the tree lean onto the open approach to the construction site, staff in hand, unhurried, moving with the complete composure of a man who had decided something and was carrying the decision in his body. No circling. No ward testing. He walked straight up the center path toward the camp with the morning sun at his back and let himself be seen, which was its own kind of statement. Harry climbed down. He wasn't the first to reach Aldrich. Godric was already there, because Godric was always already there when something came toward them, sword not drawn but hand at his hip, that specific readiness. He was watching Aldrich with the alert stillness of a man who had spent a week preparing for a threat and was now recalibrating what the threat might actually look like. Aldrich stopped 10 feet from him. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "Good," Godric said. "Because I'd have to put the sword somewhere uncomfortable if you were." Aldrich looked at him with something that might, under significant provocation, become amusement. "I know your reputation, Gryffindor. I knew your father's." He paused. "Your father was also incapable of nuance." "He was a great man," Godric said, flat and certain. "Yes," Aldrich said, without sarcasm. "He was. Greatness and nuance are not the same requirement." He looked past Godric to where Harry had arrived at his shoulder. "You told me to come through the front." "You came through the front," Harry said. "I thought about what you said." He said it simply, no performance in it. "For 3 days I thought about it. I don't agree with all of it. He shifted his gaze to the half-built walls, the towers climbing against the blue autumn sky. But I was operating from a position that, he chose the word carefully. That had become more about what I was losing than about what was actually being destroyed. Those are different problems. Harry said nothing. Gave him the space to continue. The old tradition doesn't have to end, Godric said, still looking at the walls. That's what I was arguing, functionally, that what you're building requires the old tradition to end. That there isn't room for both. He paused. I may have been wrong about that. Helga had appeared at Harry's other side with the quiet efficiency she used when she wanted to be present without being confrontational. She looked at Godric for a moment and then said, "Come and eat something. We can disagree more productively on full stomachs." Godric looked at her. The sheer uncomplicated practicality of it seemed to catch him off guard. "You're not going to, what? Argue with you at the gate?" She turned back toward the camp. "I've been arguing with people my whole life. I know what works and what doesn't. Standing in the cold accusing each other of things doesn't work." She glanced back. "Food, then argument. Come on." Godric looked at Harry. Harry shrugged. Godric sheathed the sword he hadn't drawn and followed Helga, and Godric, after a moment, followed Godric, and Harry came last and watched the strange procession toward the fire circle and thought, this is how it actually works. Not battles. Not grand pronouncements. Someone just makes breakfast and says sit down. The conversation that followed over the fire was 3 hours long and at no point polite. Godric was not a man who softened his positions for comfort. He said plainly that he believed structured magical education would over time reduce the variety of magical expression in the population, that when you taught 1,000 students the same 30 spells you produced 1,000 competent wizards with largely similar capabilities rather than the wild diversity of self-taught practitioners who each developed in genuinely unique directions. Rowena said, equally plainly, that this was statistically backwards, that the diversity argument assumed self-teaching produced equal outcomes across the population, when the evidence was that self-teaching produced extraordinary outcomes for the exceptional few and catastrophic gaps for the many who weren't exceptional or who lacked access to knowledge or who had unusual magical profiles that without guidance led to destructive uncontrolled surges. The exceptional few were sufficient before, Godric said. Sufficient for what? Rowena said. Sufficient for your standards of what magic should accomplish. You're describing a selection process that culls based on conditions of birth, not magical lineage, but circumstance. The child born near a library of magical texts has access that the child born in a village where no one can read doesn't. That's not wild diversity. That's stratification dressed as nature. Godric looked at her with what Harry recognized as the expression of someone encountering an argument they hadn't considered and finding it uncomfortably solid. He didn't concede it immediately, he wasn't that kind of person, but he folded it inward and worked on it, visibly. Godric, for his part, had entirely stopped pretending he wasn't deeply interested in the conversation and was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hands like a student, which was probably the most surprising thing Harry had seen all week. The instinct magic, Godric said, after a silence. The kind that has no name. The kind a child does before anyone teaches them anything. Will you teach that? Yes, Helga said. That's where we begin. Not with named spells. With the ground beneath the spells. She looked at him steadily. Everything I teach begins with the earth. With the student feeling where the magic actually comes from before they're given any shape to put it in. The shapes come after. Show me, Godric said. A pause. The 4 founders exchanged glances that covered a significant amount of ground in a short time. Now. Helga said. Now, Godric said. I'm here. You have a student of limited preconceptions and no prior formal training sitting in front of you. He spread his hands. Show me what the beginning looks like. Helga looked at him for a moment. Then she stood and said, come on then, with the same brisk warmth she'd used on Harry a week ago at dawn, and Aldrich unfolded himself from the log and followed her to the open ground, and Harry, watching, felt something ease in the structure of the morning. Not resolution. Not agreement. But the beginning of a conversation that could eventually become one. While Helga worked with Aldrich in the open ground, Harry found Salazar at the ward anchor in the spiral clearing, not working the ward this time, just standing in the clearing with his hands at his sides, looking at the center stone. Harry stood beside him. "He came," Salazar said. "He came. Helga will have him on the ground listening to the earth within the hour." The tone was dry but not dismissive. "She does that. She finds the part of people that isn't political and talks to that part until the political parts don't have as much room." "It's a good technique," Harry said. "It's who she is," Salazar said. "It works because it's genuine. You can't learn the technique without having the nature." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said. Yesterday, and the day before." Harry waited. "The wall built from fear becoming the architecture of hatred," Salazar said. "I've turned it over many times. From many angles." He looked at the center stone. "I want to tell you that I've resolved it. That I've found the argument that makes the fear manageable. That I can stand here and tell you the problem is solved." A pause. "I can't tell you that honestly." "I know," Harry said. "I'm still afraid," Salazar said. "The world outside these walls is genuinely hostile, and the children we bring inside them will carry what they learn here back into that hostility. That is a real danger. My response to it may be wrong, but the danger itself is real." "Yes," Harry said. "It is. And you still think the school should be open." "I think the danger you're describing is an argument for better preparation," Harry said. "Not fewer students. The answer to the world being hostile is teaching people to handle hostility, all kinds, from all directions. You can't prepare someone for a world you've filtered out of their education." Salazar turned this over. "You taught yourself to handle it." "I was dropped into it unprepared at 11 and nearly died about 17 times as a result," Harry said. "I'm not recommending my method." Salazar's expression moved toward that fractional darkness adjacent to amusement. "And yet here you are." "Here I am," Harry agreed. "Relatively intact." They stood in the clearing together for a moment, the ward humming gently in the stones around them, the dual resonance of their combined working still present in the anchor stone like a chord held after the playing. "I'm going to stay," Salazar said. "For now. I want to see what it becomes. The first year of it." He paused. "I can't promise the disagreements will end. They won't." "I know," Harry said. "But," he stopped. "Tried again. You said the version of events that history kept was a version where I left. I am aware that the same fears I carry now are the ones that drive that leaving in your account." He looked at Harry with dark eyes that were stripped, momentarily, of most of their careful architecture. "I don't want to be the wound in the thing I helped build." "Then don't be," Harry said simply. "It's not, I know it's not simple," Harry said. "I'm not saying it's simple. I'm saying the direction is simple, even if the path isn't." He looked at him. "Every day you stay, every day you choose this instead of the alternative, that's you not being the wound. That's it. That's all it is. You do it one day at a time." Salazar looked at him for a long time. "How do you know that?" he said. "That it can be done one day at a time." "Because that's how I survived the war," Harry said. "Every morning. One day. That's the whole method." A very long silence. The forest moved around them in small patient ways. "You're going to leave soon," Salazar said. It wasn't a question. "The stones cycle in 2 days," Harry said. "Rowena's calculations. She's confident. Are you ready?" Harry thought about it honestly. About Hermione and Ron and the world he'd left behind, the good parts of it, the hard parts, the persistent feeling that he'd been walking through his own life slightly sideways since the war ended, never quite finding the angle from which it made complete sense. "Yes," he said. "And no. But that's always been true." Godric found him that evening. He appeared at Harry's tent flap as the sun went down, which given Godric's usual communication style was itself significant. He was a man who said things in the open with volume, not a man who came quietly to tent flaps at dusk. Harry let him in. They sat on opposite ends of the bedroll in the small tent space, and Godric looked at his hands for a moment in a way that suggested he'd rehearsed this, and the rehearsal wasn't helping. 2 days, Godric said. 2 days. Right. He rubbed the back of his neck. I'm not good at this part. The part where you say something because it needs to be said rather than because you're about to do something about it. You're doing fine, Harry said. I haven't said anything yet. You've said more than you think. Godric looked at him with an expression that was exasperated and fond simultaneously, and then he blew out a long breath and said, You changed things here. This week. You changed what this is going to be, and I know that and you know that, and in 2 days you'll be gone, and 1,000 years from now someone will sit in the school we're building and have no idea that any of this happened. The school will know, Harry said. I put something into it. I know you did. I felt it. Godric put his hand flat on the tent floor, involuntarily, as if he could feel the foundation from here. I felt it happen, and I don't have the words Rowena has or the understanding Helga has, but I felt it, and it was, he shook his head. What you put in there. What that was. Protection, Harry said. On the side of anyone who needs it. Where did it come from? Godric said. I mean, what part of you? Where did you learn to have that? Harry thought about a woman throwing herself over a baby in a crib in Godric's hollow while green light filled the room. He thought about what it had done, not just in that moment, but everything it had made, the 17-year chain of events beginning in that small room, the shape of his entire life branching from the choice of someone who had nothing left to give except herself. Someone gave it to me, he said. Before I could understand what I was receiving. And it stayed. He looked at his hands. Magic that comes from love doesn't go away. It just finds new shapes. Godric looked at him. Your parents. My mother, Harry said. Specifically. A long quiet. Godric's expression was the expression of a warrior trying to process grief that wasn't his and finding it arrived regardless. She'd be proud, Godric said finally. Whatever she was. However she was. She'd be, he stopped. You're, the kind of person that could only come from someone very, he stopped again. Godric, Harry said. I know. Yeah, Godric said. All right. He cleared his throat enormously. The combat techniques you showed me, he said, pivoting with the determination of a man who has decided the emotional portion of the conversation is complete. I want to keep developing the feint work after you're gone. The eye reading. I need someone to train against. Salazar, Harry said immediately. Godric blinked. He's precise and he watches everything and he'll tell you exactly what you're doing wrong without softening it, Harry said. And you sparring together regularly is, trust building. You need that. Both of you. Godric stared at him. You're fixing us, he said. Helga said you weren't, but you are. I'm making suggestions, Harry said. You're the ones who have to follow them. Why does everything you suggest sound completely obvious once you've said it? Because none of it is complicated, Harry said. The complicated part is being willing to do the obvious thing. Godric looked at him for a moment and then stood up in the small tent space with the slightly awkward energy of a large man doing something careful. He put one hand on Harry's shoulder, not a clap, not a warrior's grip, but something deliberate and serious. Then he said, In my house. The house I'll build. I want it to be the kind of place that makes people like you. Harry looked up at him. What do you mean, people like me? Brave enough to act. Thoughtful enough to act well. Godric's hand tightened briefly on his shoulder. Someone who runs toward the dangerous thing but knows why they're running, and what they're running toward. He let go. Not just brave. Wisely brave. He paused. Can I build that? Harry thought about Neville Longbottom standing in the great hall with the sorting hat on fire, refusing to break, with absolutely nothing except his own conviction. He thought about Ron on a chessboard, walking into the path of the Queen. He thought about Hermione at 11 years old telling two boys she'd just met, now if you two don't mind, I'm going to bed, and meaning I would do anything for you even though I haven't known you a week. You already did, Harry said. The last full day. He spent the morning with Helga because that felt right and she seemed to know it, walking the forest perimeter together in the early cold, not discussing magic or the school or anything that required analysis. She asked him about his world, not the magic, not the history, but the small things. What food was like. Whether people still laughed the same way. Whether the forest still had this quality of being fully themselves, unhurried and complete. He described the burrow to her. The kitchen, always warm, always producing something, the smell of it. The feeling of being in a large loud family that made room without making room formally, that included you by simply continuing to exist around you and assuming your presence was natural. Helga listened with the quality of listening she had, which was the kind where you felt actually heard rather than approximately registered. You love them, she said. Yes. Are you going back to them? Yes. He paused. I wasn't sure, before I came here. I'd been, not away from them, but not fully back either. Still somewhere in the war, I think, even 3 years after it ended. He looked at the trees. This place, this time, it did something. Being somewhere that has to be built instead of defended. He paused. I think I know how to go home now. Good, she said simply. That's good. She was quiet for a moment. What did we give you? The 4 of us. If I can ask. Harry thought about it honestly. Godric showed me that strength isn't just force, it's the discipline to fight well, which means being willing to see your own patterns. He paused. You showed me the ground underneath the spells. The part I'd been using without knowing it since I was 11, the part that comes from something deeper than technique. He paused. Rowena showed me that thinking about magic rather than just doing it isn't a weakness. That understanding what something is can make you better at it without making it smaller. He paused. And Salazar, Helga said softly. Salazar showed me that the hardest thing isn't facing an enemy, Harry said. It's sitting with someone who loves something the same way you love it but is terrified of losing it, and staying steady while they work out whether the fear is bigger than the love. He paused. He'll be all right, he said, and he meant it not as reassurance but as actual belief, the kind grounded in what he'd seen in the spiral clearing and the morning forest. Helga looked at him. You think so? I think he chose to stay, Harry said. And I think every day he stays he gets a little further from the version of events where he doesn't. He paused. The fracture doesn't have to happen the same way. History kept one version. It doesn't mean there aren't others. Helga stopped walking and looked at him. The morning light was in the trees around them, broken gold, and she had that quality she had sometimes of being completely still in a way that was entirely unlike Salazar's careful stillness. This was the stillness of something that had no reason to move because it was already where it was supposed to be. She hugged him. It was uncomplicated and complete, the way Helga did everything, no qualification, no hesitation, the full commitment of someone who had decided this was the appropriate response and seen no reason to moderate it. Harry, who had not expected it, stood for about half a second being surprised and then returned it, and it felt like being held by something that was entirely on his side, which was the feeling she put into everything. Come back, she said. If it's possible. If the stones ever, if there's a way. Come back. If there's a way, Harry said into her shoulder, I'll come back. She let go and straightened and looked entirely composed except for the brightness in her eyes, and they turned back toward the camp and walked the rest of the way in a silence that was full of everything useful and needed nothing added. Rowena gave him books. She appeared at his tent in the early afternoon with a satchel that was heavier than its size suggested and put it down on the bedroll with the efficiency of someone completing a practical task and not drawing attention to the fact that it was also an emotional one. "My notes," she said. "On the theoretical framework from the working yesterday. On the resonance calculations. She paused. On several theoretical structures that I've been developing since you described your time. None of them should be disruptive to your timeline because they're theoretical only, no practical workings, no specific inventions. Just, directions of thought that you taking back with you will accelerate rather than initiate." "Rowena," Harry said. "You've been up all night." "I've been up most nights since you arrived," she said. "I sleep less than other people. I find it inefficient." She paused. "The notes are also," she stopped. Started again. "They are also partially personal. Questions I've wanted to ask about your time that I haven't asked because they're not theoretical. Things I wanted to know for their own sake." She looked at him. "You don't have to read those parts." "I'll read all of it," Harry said. She looked at him and the analytical distance dropped entirely, which had been happening more frequently in the last 2 days and which Harry had stopped trying to pretend he didn't notice. "What you put into the foundation," she said. "The will toward protection. The thing that wants to be on the side of the frightened student." She paused. "I felt it happen. I helped it happen. And I felt, when it settled into the stones, I felt what it was, underneath the magical structure." She looked at him steadily. "It was you. The actual core of what you are. And it was, enormous. Not powerful in the combat sense, not impressive in the technical sense. Just," she searched for the word. "Large," Harry offered. "Yes," she said. "Unexpectedly, quietly large. The way mountains are large, not because they perform it, but because that's simply what they are." She looked at her hands. "I've met extraordinary practitioners. I'd be arrogant to pretend I'm not one myself. But I've never met anyone whose core intention was that specific and that." She stopped again. "Rowena," Harry said gently. "Pure," she said, and said it the way someone says a word they've been avoiding because it's the most accurate one and accuracy sometimes costs something. "Pure is an imprecise word but it's the right one. Your intent toward protection is without ambivalence. Without self-interest. There's no part of it that's about you." "That's not," Harry started. "Harry," she said, with a precision that closed the argument before it formed. "I built the theoretical framework for that working. I was inside the structure of your intention while it transferred. I know what was there." She met his eyes. "Don't argue with me about something I've measured." He stopped arguing. She looked at him for a moment more with an expression that was composed and also completely open, both things simultaneously, the way only a person of real intelligence could manage, holding two contradictory internal states without resolving them into something more comfortable. "I'm going to name something after you," she said. Harry blinked. "What?" "The property. The foundational working. In my notes, I need to name it for reference, the theoretical framework for permanent intentional anchoring via personal resonance." She paused. "I'm calling the framework the Potter methodology." He stopped. Thought about the fact that somewhere in 1,000 years of magical history there might be a theoretical paper referring to the Potter methodology and no one would have any idea who Potter was or why he had a methodology or what he'd been doing in a forest in medieval Scotland at the founding of the greatest magical school in the world. "That's perfect," he said. The corner of her mouth moved, and this time it completed the journey, a real smile, brief and full, the kind that rearranged everything in her face, and Harry stored it like something rare and worth keeping. She picked up her empty satchel and turned to go. At the tent flap she paused. "Harry." "Yes." What you said. About the Patronus. That joy isn't an absence of darkness, it's a separate substance. She kept her back to him. I've been thinking about that since you said it, and I believe it's the most important magical observation I've heard in my lifetime. She paused. Thank you for it. Then she was gone, moving through the camp with her quick purposeful stride, and Harry sat on the bedroll with her satchel of notes in his lap and looked at the tent ceiling for a long time. The stones were ready at dawn on the 8th day. He felt it before Rowena came to tell him, the time-turner chain warming at his wrist, the amber sand in the cracked glass shifting in its spiral again, purposeful now rather than restless. The direction of the pull had reversed, where it had brought him here, now it was oriented forward, toward the future, toward home. He was packed, not much to pack, he'd arrived with almost nothing, but Rowena's satchel of notes was slung over his shoulder and he had a small additional item in his jacket pocket, something Helga had pressed into his hand at breakfast without comment, a smooth river stone carved with a rune he recognized from Helga's foundational workings. Anchor. She'd said nothing about it. He'd said nothing back. He'd put it in his pocket and felt it there, warm and small and permanent. The standing stones were at the eastern edge of the forest, a 10-minute walk from the camp. All 4 founders walked with him, which he hadn't expected and which made the walk feel like something that needed a word more specific than significant. The morning was still and cold. Frost on the grass. The sky pale at the eastern horizon where the sun was climbing, everything silver and blue before the gold arrived. The forest held them for 10 minutes in its ancient silence and then gave way to the standing stone circle, which had the quality this morning of something fully awake. The temporal markers Harry had felt on arrival were blazing, visible as heat shimmer around the upright stones, the amber resonance cycling visibly for the first time since he'd arrived. He stopped at the circle's edge and turned to face them. Godric looked at him with everything he'd said last night still present in his face, the decision about what his house was going to be still fresh in it, and he said nothing but he put out his hand, warrior's grip, wrist to wrist, and Harry took it and felt the strength in it and the deliberateness. When the school opens, Godric said. First class of students. I'm going to think of you. Think of the students, Harry said. That's the point. Godric's grip tightened once. Both, he said. Released. Helga kissed his cheek with the matter-of-factness of someone who had decided this was what was happening and the universe would accommodate. The stone has your frequency now, she said quietly. You'll always feel us when you're in the building. The heartbeat, you'll know it. She stepped back. Salazar looked at him for a long moment and then said, quietly, in Parseltongue, come back if the path opens. There is more to learn. Harry answered in the same tongue, I know. I'll try. A pause. Then Salazar said, in English, precisely and with full weight, thank you. It was 2 words and they contained approximately everything, the way Salazar preferred things, compressed, dense, precisely aimed. Harry understood them fully. Stay, Harry said back, and let that one word carry its own weight. Salazar held his gaze. Nodded once. Harry turned to Rowena last. She stood with her circlet at her brow and her parchment, always the parchment, and she looked at him with those precise grey-blue eyes and said, the notes. Read the theoretical sections first, there's an ordering that makes the framework clearer if you follow it sequentially. I'll read it your way, Harry said. Also, she paused. Looked at the satchel. The last section. The personal questions. She looked back at him. You don't have to answer them. But if you, she stopped. I'll answer them, Harry said. How do I get the answers back to you? It's 1,000 years. She smiled, the real one again, brief and transformative. You'll find a way, she said. You're unexpectedly resourceful. He laughed, and she made a small sound that was close to the same thing, and it was the best exit he could have asked for. He stepped into the circle. The standing stones responded immediately, the amber resonance intensifying, the temporal markers flaring, the deep bass resonance of the time-working building from the ground upward through the soles of his feet. The chain at his wrist burned, orientation forward, everything aligned. He looked at the four of them standing at the circle's edge in the early morning light. Godric, red gold and enormous, already the legend he would become and also just a man who had asked to be wisely brave. Helga, small and solid and the truest expression of the thing they were all trying to build. Rowena with her parchment, with the real smile still present in the corners of her expression. Salazar, precisely still, dark-eyed, choosing to stay, one day at a time, beginning this morning. The standing stones screamed amber light. Harry held the image of their four faces as the world went sideways, not violently this time, not grabbed and pulled, but smoothly, like a tide going the right direction, and he fell forward through the light toward a world 1,000 years away that he'd learned, finally, in the most literal possible sense, where it came from. The Department of Mysteries. He hit the floor and rolled and came up in a crouch with his wand in his hand before the light had fully faded, old instinct, irreducible. The room was exactly as he'd left it. The examination table, the spelled glass of the containment frame, except the containment frame was empty, the time turner gone, the amber burn marks on the table the only evidence that something had been there. The lights were the same cold ministry lighting. The walls were the same walls. But it was different. The room smelled the same, ozone and old decisions, but underneath it, very faintly, like something heard in a shell, was something else. Earth and pine and the particular sharp cold air of very early morning in a forest that had never been managed. He stood up slowly and looked at the room. His wrist was bare, the chain was gone, fully dissolved, the skin beneath it unmarked except for a faint warmth that faded as he stood there. The cracked glass of the time turner had also dissolved, taking the amber sand with it, the whole device simply, done. Used up completely. A seed that had become what it was always going to become and had nothing left to be. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and found the anchor stone. Smooth, warm, the rune under his thumb. He put his other hand flat on the floor. And felt it. Immediately. The heartbeat of the building, the deep foundation magic that was fully present in every inch of Hogwarts structure, and underneath it, underneath all of it, the dual resonance of his own signature woven into the bedrock alongside Salazar's, permanent and steady, placed there 8 days ago and 1,000 years ago simultaneously. I know you, the building said, in the language of warmth and ground. I know, Harry said back, without speaking. He sat on the floor of the Department of Mysteries with the anchor stone in his palm and the school's heartbeat under his hands and stayed there for a while, not because he was injured or disoriented but because it was good to sit here, to feel this. To know the thing he'd grown up inside, this building that had been home when nothing else was, to know where it came from and what had been put into it and why it had always felt the way it felt. He was here for about 20 minutes before the door opened and Petra appeared on the stairs with her notepad and her expression of someone who had arrived expecting to collect data on a minor irregularity and was rapidly revising upward. She looked at the empty containment frame. At Harry on the floor. At the anchor stone in his hand. At the fact that he was wearing an expression she clearly hadn't seen on him before. You're back. I'm back, Harry confirmed. The time turner, gone. Used up. I'll explain it in the report. He stood up, brushing his knees. He picked up Rowena's satchel from where it had landed beside him, still there, the notes inside intact, and slung it over his shoulder. How long were you gone? Petra said, pencil raised. 8 days, Harry said. Give or take 1,000 years. She wrote something in her notepad with the steady diligence of a person who had decided her job required her to write down everything, including things she didn't understand yet. Harry looked at the empty room. The examination table, the spelled glass, the walls of the Department of Mysteries doing what they always did, holding the weight of questions that didn't have easy answers. Petra, he said. Yes. I need to take a week off. He paused. I need to go see my friends. She looked up from her notepad. You have friends? He laughed, which surprised her and surprised him slightly, a full easy sound, the kind that lived in the chest rather than just the throat. Yeah, he said. I do. He went to the burrow first. Because of course he went to the burrow first, there was really nowhere else he could have gone, no other beginning point for the part of his life that came after this. The burrow at mid-morning in October was orange-leafed and warm-windowed and smelled of bread and something that might have been Molly Weasley's catastrophically good cooking from 50 meters away. A chicken was doing something complicated in the garden. One of the gnomes was perched on the fence post apparently just watching the countryside, which seemed like a new development in gnome ambition. Harry stood at the gate for a moment before going in. He did this sometimes, stood at the threshold of things before walking through them, not from hesitation but from the habit of presence, the practice of being actually here rather than somewhere slightly adjacent. It was a habit he'd been developing for the last 3 years without understanding entirely where it came from. He thought now that it was the war's gift, the specific thing the worst experience of his life had given him, the ability to recognize good moments at the moment of their occurrence rather than only in retrospect. The door opened before he knocked. Hermione stood in the doorway in the specific way she stood when she'd known you were coming, because she always knew you were coming before you knocked. She had notification charms on both gates and the back garden and possibly the gnome. She looked at him with her brown eyes, precise and warm simultaneously, always both, and then she looked at all of him the way she looked when she was taking a complete inventory rather than just a surface reading. You look different, she said. Do I? Yes. She stepped back to let him in. Not older. Not, I don't know exactly. Less like you're waiting for something bad. He thought about that. I think I went somewhere and it settled something. He paused in the doorway. I'll explain the whole thing. It'll take a while. I have time, Hermione said. Ron's in the kitchen eating everything that survived breakfast. We have tea. She paused. Harry. Are you all right? Yes, he said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant it in a long time, not the reassuring yes of someone who decided the question didn't need a real answer, but the actual yes of someone who had checked and found that the thing asked about was genuinely true. Hermione looked at him for another moment. Then she did something she rarely did without warning. She hugged him, quick and tight, her arms around him with the ferocity of 3 years of watching him walk slightly sideways through his own life. Good, she said, into his shoulder. That's good. Come inside. He came inside. He sat at the Weasley table, that enormous battered table that had held every version of his life that was worth keeping, and drank tea and ate whatever Ron had not yet eaten of the breakfast remnants and let the conversation move around him. Ron had 3 different opinions about Quidditch developments and also a story about a Confundus charm gone wrong on an Auror training exercise that was genuinely very funny and involved a chicken. Harry laughed at all the right places and some of the wrong places, and it felt like a language he'd been away from and had come back to find completely intact. After a while, when Ron had gone to find something he'd apparently hidden from himself the previous week, Hermione said, "Tell me what happened." He told her. Not everything at once, it was too large for that, it required the kind of telling that needed pauses and tea and the occasional interjection. He told her about the time turner, about the clearing, about the 4 founders in the mud at the edge of their half-built castle. He told her about Helga's lessons and what the earth felt like when you stopped reaching for it. He told her about the duel with Godric and the spiral clearing and the language of serpents shared with a man who loved something and was afraid of losing it. He told her about Aldrich and what he'd said to him in the clearing at midnight and why it had worked. He told her about the foundational working. What he'd put into the stones. Where it had come from. Hermione listened with both hands wrapped around her mug and her eyes getting increasingly bright in the way that meant she was working very hard at not crying, which was Hermione's specific version of being moved, the effort of containment visible in the set of her jaw, the too frequent blinks. When he stopped she was quiet for a moment. The room of requirement, she said. Yes. You built the impulse that became the room of requirement. Rowena and I did. And the school's responsiveness. The way it always seemed to know that too. Hermione set down her mug very carefully. Harry, she said. I know. That's not, she stopped. Started again. That's not a small thing. No, he agreed. You went back 1,000 years and the thing you left in the foundation of the school was, she stopped again, and this time the containment failed, briefly, one tear down, immediately dealt with. The thing you left was yourself. Your actual core intention, permanently anchored into the place that, she pressed her lips together. Into the place that raised us. Yes, Harry said softly. A silence. The burrow kitchen settled around them in its warm particular way, the fire low, the smell of bread, the chicken possibly still doing something complicated in the garden. Rowena Ravenclaw, Hermione said carefully, wrote a theoretical framework for the working and called it the Potter methodology. Yes. And those notes are in the satchel. Yes. She looked at the satchel on the table with an expression that Harry recognized as the most Hermione expression in her entire repertoire, the expression of someone facing something so significant that even she was not entirely sure of the correct response to it. Can I read them? She said. I was going to make you promise to read the theoretical sections in order, Harry said, but that's apparently a Rowena Ravenclaw instruction and I feel like you'd follow it naturally. Of course I'd read them in order, Hermione said, already reaching for the satchel. Harry let her. Ron came back downstairs eventually and found them at the table together, Hermione 3 sections deep into a 1,000-year-old theoretical framework with a self-inking quill making notes in the margins, and Harry with his hands wrapped around his 4th cup of tea and an expression that Ron apparently had not seen before because he stopped in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. You all right, mate? He said. Yeah, Harry said. Really, genuinely yeah. Ron sat down and looked at him for another moment with the specific Ron quality of care, practical, present, not requiring explanation. He picked up an apple from the bowl on the table and said, Quidditch, in the tone of offering something simple and specific and exactly right. Quidditch, Harry confirmed. They talked about Quidditch for an hour. It was perfect. That evening, walking back from the burrow through the October dark, Harry put his hand in his pocket and found the anchor stone and held it and felt the warmth of it. Somewhere to the north, past London, past the country between, in the place that had always been home before he knew what home was, the school stood, lit windows in dark towers, students inside it learning things and arguing and falling asleep in libraries and finding rooms that knew what they needed before they could ask. And in its foundation, in the bedrock beneath the great hall where the first stone had been laid on an October morning 1,000 years ago, his intention was anchored. Running through the whole structure like a frequency, permanent and patient, on the side of anyone who needed it. He walked home through the dark and the school hummed at the edge of his awareness, distant and familiar, and it felt like knowing someone was there. Not behind him, not watching, just there, the way good things are there. Solid. Continuous. Built to last. He went home. He slept deeply, without waking, for the first time in 3 years. And in the morning he woke and thought, one day. And then the day started. 3 months later, in the restricted section of the Hogwarts library, a student named Petra Clearwater, no relation to the unspeakable, the universe occasionally made gestures like this, found a sealed document in the back of a shelf that the catalog hadn't indexed. The seal was a rune she didn't recognize immediately but which the headmistress, when shown it, identified after some research as an extremely early version of the Hogwarts crest, from the founding era, before the standardization of the imagery. Inside the document was a letter, the parchment extraordinary old, written in a hand that was deliberate and precise and cross-referenced its own footnotes. At the top of the letter, in ink still dark despite the centuries, were 3 words, for the curious. Petra read it in one sitting and didn't sleep for 2 days afterward. She wrote 11 pages of notes. She went to see the headmistress again, this time with questions, and was told that some things about the founding of the school were simply not fully known, that gaps in the historical record existed, that not everything had been preserved, that this was the nature of time. Petra went back to the restricted section and looked at the shelf where the letter had been and found, beside the empty space, a small smooth stone carved with a single rune. She kept it. She didn't know why, exactly. It just felt right to keep it. It felt, in the particular way that the school sometimes felt things, like it had been waiting for her specifically. Outside, above the October forest, a stag made of silver light crossed the sky over the forbidden forest and disappeared into the trees, unhurried, entirely real. The school watched it go. The school remembered.